Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've debated whether to share this for decades, but I'm not getting any younger, and some truths deserve to be told. What happened to us at Flea Creek in 1885 changed me forever. I was just 22 years old then, full of that youthful confidence that makes a man believe nothing in this world can truly harm him. How wrong I was. It was early autumn when my brother Joseph and I joined our friends Alexander and John MacDonald for what was supposed to be a 3-day hunting trip in the bushland near Flea Creek. We'd been there before, beautiful country with plenty of game and good fishing in the creek. We packed light, our rifles, ammunition, some salted meat, flour for damper, tea, and our swags. The plan was to live off whatever we could hunt. We set out at dawn from Queanbeyan, riding for most of the day before reaching the area where we planned to make camp. Joseph and I had a friendly wager going about who would bag the first deer. The MacDonald brothers were more interested in fishing, though we all carried our rifles as a matter of course. In those days, you never went into the bush unarmed. The weather was unusually cool for that time of year. I remember the way the mist hung in the valleys as we rode through, giving everything an eerie quality. By late afternoon, we found a decent spot to set up camp. A small clearing about 50 yards from the creek, sheltered by tall eucalypts and some wattles. The ground was relatively flat, with good visibility in most directions. Joseph and Alexander gathered firewood, while John and I unpacked the horses. I was tying up the last horse when I first noticed something odd. The animal seemed agitated, rolling its eyes and pulling at the rope. At the time, I assumed it was just tired from the journey or perhaps smelled a dingo nearby. "Settle down," I told it, patting its neck. "We'll be here just a few days." As dusk approached, we had a good fire going and were preparing to cook some damper when we heard it for the first time. A deep, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite a growl, not exactly a roar. The closest I can describe it is a bellowing, but deeper and more unsettling than any cattle I've ever heard. "What in God's name was that?" Alexander asked, freezing with the damper mix still in his hands. "Probably just a bull that's wandered off from one of the stations," Joseph suggested, but I could tell from his face he didn't believe it. "No cattle sound like that," John said quietly, reaching for his rifle. "And there aren't any stations close enough for strays to wander this far." We listened intently, but the sound didn't repeat immediately. Instead, the forest seemed to go unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing but the crackling of our fire. That silence was almost worse than the bellowing. "Might be best to keep the fire high tonight," I suggested, trying to sound calmer than I felt. The others nodded in agreement. We ate in relative silence, each of us listening to the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight. The horses remained unsettled, occasionally stamping and snorting. Just as we were finishing our meal, we heard it again. That same deep, guttural bellow, but closer this time. Much closer. Then came the sound of something moving through the underbrush, not the careful steps of a dingo or fox, nor the crash of a startled kangaroo, but something large and deliberate. The snapping of branches and rustling of leaves came from the direction of the creek, moving toward our camp. We all stood up, rifles in hand, facing the darkness. "Hello there," John called out. "Identify yourself." No response came except another of those bellows. This one so close it sent a chill down my spine. I remember the way my hands trembled as I cocked my rifle. Then we saw it. At the edge of our firelight, a figure emerged from the darkness. At first glance, it had the stature of a man, tall, perhaps 6.5 or 7 feet in height, But as it came closer, the similarities ended. Its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, with little or no neck visible. Its body was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair, matted in places. But it was the way it moved that truly unnerved me. Long, fluid strides that covered ground faster than a man should be able to move. "Stop right there!" Alexander shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The creature paused just at the edge of our camp. In the flickering firelight, I could make out more details. Arms that hung too long for its body, fingers that seemed to end in claws or thick nails. Its face was obscured by hair, but I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the firelight. Not red like some campfire tales would have you believe, but a dull amber color that somehow seemed intelligent. It tilted its head slightly, studying us. Then it opened its mouth and let out another of those bellows, revealing teeth that were certainly not human. "I'm warning you!" John raised his rifle to his shoulder. "Come no closer!" The creature took another step forward, apparently undeterred by our warnings or our weapons. It was then that I noticed the smell, a powerful, musky odor like wet fur mixed with something rotten. Joseph fired first, the crack of his rifle shattering the tension. The creature jerked backwards but didn't fall. Alexander and John fired next, almost simultaneously. I hesitated just a moment longer, some part of me reluctant to shoot at something that walked upright like a man. But when it bellowed again and took another step toward us, I pulled the trigger. The creature staggered, turned, and moved back into the darkness with surprising speed. We heard it crashing through the underbrush, moving away from our camp. "Did we kill it?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we hit it," John replied, already reloading his rifle. "I'm sure I saw blood on the rocks where it stood." "Should we go after it?" Joseph asked, looking to me as the eldest. "Not in the dark," I said firmly. "That would be madness. We'll check in the morning." None of us slept that night. We kept the fire blazing and took turns keeping watch, jumping at every sound from the forest. The horses remained nervous throughout the night, and twice more we heard that bellowing, though more distant now. At first light, with rifles loaded and nerves frayed, we ventured to where the creature had stood. John had been right. There were dark stains on the rocks that could have been blood, though they looked unusually dark and thick. But what truly confirmed we hadn't imagined the whole thing were the footprints. They were long, man-like, but larger than any human foot I'd ever seen, with toes that splayed outward. We followed the tracks to the edge of the creek where they disappeared into the water. "It crossed the creek," Alexander suggested. "We could follow—" "No," I interrupted. "We're packing up and leaving." "Now!" Joseph started to protest but fell silent when he saw my face. I can't explain the dread I felt, the absolute certainty that if we pursued this thing, we would regret it profoundly. We broke camp in record time, barely speaking as we packed our gear and saddled the horses. The forest seemed to watch us, and more than once I thought I caught glimpses of movement among the trees, though it might have been my imagination by that point. As we rode away, John was convinced we'd wounded the creature. "I hit it square in the chest," he insisted. "No animal could survive that." "That was no animal," Joseph said quietly. "At least, not one I've ever seen." "Then what was it?" Alexander demanded. "Some kind of bushman? An aboriginal?" I shook my head. "No aboriginal man looks like that or makes those sounds. And no bushman I've ever heard of stands 7 feet tall with no neck and covered in hair." We rode hard that day, not stopping until we reached the outskirts of Queanbeyan. We agreed to tell people we'd been spooked by a large animal, possibly a feral bull, but not the full truth. Who would believe us? Even now, 45 years later, I question my own memories sometimes. But I know what I saw. I know what all 4 of us saw. The McDonald brothers have both passed on now, and Joseph rarely speaks of that night anymore, but I still remember every detail. The smell, the way it moved, those amber eyes reflecting our firelight. I've never returned to Flea Creek. though I've heard stories over the years of similar encounters in that region. Some call it the Yahoo or the Australian ape man. Others use Aboriginal names I can't pronounce. Whatever it was real. And sometimes on autumn nights when the wind blows a certain way, I swear I can still hear that deep, guttural bellowing in the distance, and my hands start to shake, just like they did all those years ago. I still don't know if we wounded it or killed it. Part of me hopes we did neither, that it simply retreated deep into parts of the bush where men rarely venture. But another part of me, the part that remembers those intelligent eyes studying us, wonders if it's still out there, remembering us as clearly as I remember it. Story 2. I don't talk about this much. Actually, I've barely told anyone outside my family. It happened back in the summer of '75. Might have been '76, but I'm pretty sure it was '75. I was 18, just finished high school, working on my dad's farm in northern Minnesota. Our place was about 35 miles west of Duluth, pretty remote. Not completely isolated. We had neighbors, but they were spread out. The landscape there is a patchwork of small farms, hay fields, dense timber sections, and lots of swampland. Beautiful country, but wild in places. My dad had built this sauna near a small stream on our property. Nothing fancy, just a little wooden structure with a changing room attached to the main sauna room. We'd heat it up with wood, and it was great after a long day of farm work. The stream nearby was perfect for cooling off between sauna sessions. That day, I remember it was hot and humid, even for July. I'd been baling hay since sunrise, and by late afternoon, I was completely beat. My muscles ached, and I was covered in sweat, dust, and hay particles. My dad and brothers were still out in the fields, but I'd finished my section early and decided to treat myself to some alone time in the sauna. I fired it up around 6 in the evening. The sauna was about 3/4 of a mile from our farmhouse, down a dirt track that cut through some woods. I drove there in our old pickup, brought some water, a towel, and not much else. After getting it nice and hot, I spent maybe 30 minutes inside, sweating everything out. It felt amazing. The sun was getting lower, but it was still plenty light outside, that northern summer light that seems to stretch on forever. When I got too hot, I decided to cool off by the stream. This was routine for me. I'd sit on this big flat rock right by the water. I was completely naked, which wasn't a big deal since the sauna was private property and far from any roads or neighbors. I was just sitting there, letting the light breeze cool my skin, listening to the stream bubbling over the rocks. It was peaceful. Then something changed. You know that feeling when you're alone, but suddenly you're not. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck. That's what happened. At first I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just nerves or my imagination, but it got stronger. This overwhelming sense that someone was staring at me. I turned around to look back at the sauna, thinking maybe my brother had followed me down to use it after I was done. That's when I saw it. Behind the sauna, peering over the roof edge, was a head and shoulders. The roof eave was about 6.5 feet high, so whatever this was, it was tall, really tall. "Mike, that you?" I called out, thinking it had to be my older brother playing some stupid joke. But as soon as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't Mike. It wasn't anyone I knew. It wasn't even human. The face was dark, covered in hair. I couldn't make out features clearly in the evening light, but I could see enough. The head was massive, sitting on wide, sloping shoulders. It was just watching me, not moving, just staring. I froze, completely froze. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then it moved. It ducked down behind the sauna, out of sight. I still couldn't move. I kept staring at the spot where it had been, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe a trick of the light. Maybe I was overheated from the sauna. But then it appeared again, on the other side of the sauna. Same thing, just the head and shoulders visible above the eave. but now I could see it better. It was standing at least 2 or 3 feet taller than the sauna roofline. That would put it at 8 or 9 feet tall, maybe more. The hair covering it was dark brown or black. Its head was shaped differently than a human's, more conical, with no visible neck. Just this massive head sitting on those huge shoulders. It was still just watching me, not making a sound, not moving except to shift from one side of the sauna to the other. I don't know how long we stared at each other, probably only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then it disappeared again, ducking down behind the sauna. This time I managed to unfreeze. I remember looking down and realizing I was completely naked, completely vulnerable. I had no weapons, no protection. I was just a skinny farm kid sitting on a rock. I jumped up and ran to the sauna, practically falling through the door into the changing room. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grab my clothes. I pulled on my jeans without even drying off, yanked my t-shirt over my head, and shoved my feet into my boots without socks. The whole time, I was listening for footsteps, for any sign that it was coming closer, but there was nothing. Just the normal sounds of the woods and the stream. I grabbed the keys to the pickup and bolted out the door. I didn't look around. I just ran straight for the truck, jumped in, and locked the doors. The engine took 2 tries to start, and those few seconds were the longest of my life. I drove back to the farmhouse way too fast, bouncing all over that dirt track. I kept checking the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see something massive coming after me through the trees. But there was nothing. When I got to the house, my dad and brothers had just come in from the fields. They took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" my dad asked. I tried to explain, but the words came out all jumbled. "At the sauna, I saw something. It was huge, looking at me, over the roof." My older brother Mike laughed at first, thinking I was joking, but my dad could see I was genuinely terrified. "Slow down," he said. "What exactly did you see?" I took a deep breath and told them everything. As I talked, their expressions changed from skeptical to concerned. "You're saying it was how tall?" my dad asked. "At least 8 feet, maybe 9. It was standing behind the sauna, and I could see its head and shoulders above the roof." My youngest brother, who was 16, said, "Maybe it was a bear." I shook my head. It wasn't a bear. It was standing upright. And its face. It wasn't a bear face. My dad was quiet for a minute. Then he went to the gun cabinet and took out 2 shotguns. He handed one to Mike and kept one for himself. "Let's go take a look," he said. Part of me didn't want to go back there, but another part needed to know if there was any evidence, anything to prove I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. We all piled into Dad's truck. Him, my 3 brothers, and me. We brought flashlights and a couple of gas lanterns since it was getting darker now. The drive back to the sauna was tense. Nobody talked much. I think my brothers were still skeptical, but they could see how shaken up I was. When we got there, Dad made us stay in the truck while he and Mike checked around the sauna first, shotguns ready. I watched them through the windshield, my heart still racing. After a few minutes, Dad waved us over. They hadn't seen anything, but they did find something. On both sides of the sauna, where I'd seen the creature looking over the roof, the tall grass was flattened in large areas, like something big and heavy had been standing there. "Could be deer," Mike suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. We spent about an hour searching the area with flashlights. Dad and Mike even ventured a little way into the woods, but they didn't go far in the growing darkness. We didn't find any footprints. The ground was too dry and hard in most places, and where it was softer near the stream, there were just indistinct depressions, nothing clear enough to identify. As we were about to leave, my brother Tom pointed to something on a low branch of a pine tree near the sauna. It was a tuft of dark hair caught on the rough bark about 7 feet off the ground. Dad carefully removed it and examined it in the lantern light. It was coarse and dark brown, about 3 inches long, not like human hair, not like any animal hair we recognized either. "We'll have someone look at this," Dad said, putting it in his shirt pocket. But he never did. I think he wasn't sure he wanted to know. On the drive back to the house, Dad was quiet. Finally, he said, "Mrs. Johnson from down the road called last week. Said she saw something big crossing her backfield at dusk. Thought it might be a bear, but it was walking on two legs." I remembered something else then. Remember how Chuck, the school bus driver, used to talk about seeing something on his morning route? Something tall and dark, crossing the gravel roads? We'd all laughed it off then. Chuck was known for telling tall tales, but now I wasn't laughing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that face, those eyes watching me. I kept the shotgun next to my bed for weeks afterward. We never went to that sauna after dark again. Dad installed floodlights around it the next weekend, and we never went there alone either, always at least two of us together. I never saw the creature again, never found any more evidence. The hair sample disappeared. Dad said he lost it, but I think he just wanted to forget the whole thing. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. Could it have been a person in some kind of costume? But who would do that way out on our property? A bear standing upright. But the proportions were all wrong, and it moved from one side of the sauna to the other so quickly and quietly. The thing that still gets me all these years later is why it was just watching me. It could have easily come after me. I was completely vulnerable. But it didn't. It just observed. Like it was curious. I've never told this story outside my family until now. For years, I convinced myself it was just a weird experience, something I'd misinterpreted because I was tired or overheated from the sauna. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm back home visiting the old farm, I still get that feeling, that prickling on the back of my neck, that sense that something is watching me from just beyond the tree line. Whatever it was, it's still out there in those woods, and it's still watching. Story 3. I've never fully told this story because, honestly, who the hell would believe me? But it's been 20 years, and I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes thinking about that evening in Tensus Parish. It was April 2004, and I was 16. My parents shipped me off to my grandparents' property near Waterproof, Louisiana, for spring break. They said it would build character to spend time away from video games. My cousin Aaron was there too, about a year older than me, and we were both typical teenagers, bored out of our minds in the middle of nowhere. My grandparents owned this big piece of land, about 40 acres with fields that backed up to dense woods. The kind of woods that just look wrong somehow, like they're too thick, too old. During the day it wasn't so bad, but as evening came, those trees looked like they were watching you. That particular evening after dinner, Aaron suggested we walk the property line before it got dark. There wasn't much else to do, and Grandpa had been complaining about coyotes getting into his chicken coop, so we figured we'd check the fence line. We grabbed some flashlights, though we didn't think we'd need them yet. The sun was just starting to set, painting everything this weird orange-gold color. We were walking along the edge of the field, maybe half a mile from the house, where it borders the tree line. We were just bullshitting about school and girls, nothing serious. I remember kicking at dirt clods and complaining about missing a party back home. That's when Aaron stopped dead in his tracks and grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "What the fuck is that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze across the field, along the opposite tree line about 150 yards away. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe a bear, though there aren't supposed to be bears in that part of Louisiana. But then it moved, and I felt this immediate primal wrongness. It was huge, way bigger than a person, and covered in this reddish-brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like long hair that hung off its body. It was walking on two legs along the edge of the trees, kind of hunched over but still tall as hell. Its arms were way too long, hanging almost to its knees. The proportions were all wrong. Its chest was broad, like a barrel, and its head, God, its head seemed to just sink right between its shoulders, like it barely had a neck. "Is that a bear?" I whispered, even though I knew damn well it wasn't. Bears don't walk like that, Aaron said. His voice was shaking. We stood there frozen, watching it move. It hadn't seen us yet. It was just walking, stopping occasionally to look into the woods or down at the ground. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was like seeing something your brain can't process. Then Aaron's flashlight slipped from his hand and hit a rock. The sound wasn't even that loud, but in that moment, it might as well have been a gunshot. The thing stopped, then it turned. Even from that distance, I could feel it looking right at us. For maybe 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then it let out this sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It wasn't a roar like a lion or a bear. It was deeper, more guttural, but also had this high pitch to it at the end. The closest I can describe it is like someone trying to mimic a mountain lion's scream, but through a bass amplifier. It echoed across the field, and I swear to God I felt it in my chest. And then it started running straight toward us. I've played football. I've seen Olympic sprinters. Nothing moves like that thing did. It covered ground in these massive strides, arms swinging at its sides. It was coming right for us, and it was coming fast. "Run!" Aaron screamed, and suddenly I could move again. We took off toward the house, but it was at least half a mile away across open field. There was no way we'd make it. Aaron veered right, toward an old dried-up creek bed that cut through the property. "This way!" he yelled, and I followed him without thinking. We half ran, half fell down the embankment into the creek bed, which was about 6 feet deep and bone dry that time of year. We pressed our backs against the dirt wall, trying to catch our breath. I could hear it getting closer. Heavy footsteps pounding the ground above us. Then everything went quiet, too quiet. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing, just the sound of blood rushing in my ears. "Did it leave?" I whispered. Aaron shook his head, eyes wide with fear. No way it lost us that fast. Then we heard it, shuffling movements along the edge of the creek bed. It was right above us, walking back and forth. I could hear its breathing now. Deep, deep, heavy breaths that didn't sound human at all. Suddenly, dirt and small rocks showered down on us as it moved along the edge. We pressed ourselves tighter against the wall, trying to become invisible. Then something hit the creek bed a few feet away from us. A rock about the size of a softball. Then another rock, closer this time. "It's throwing rocks at us," Aaron hissed in disbelief. I didn't want to believe it. That meant it wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It was thinking. It was trying to flush us out. Another rock came down, and this one hit Aaron in the shoulder. He let out a yelp of pain before he could stop himself. Immediately we heard it move, fast, to position itself right above where we were hiding. We could see dirt crumbling down from the edge where it was standing. "We have to move," I said. "On 3, we run that way." I pointed down the creek bed, toward where I knew there was an old tobacco drying shed about 100 yards away. It wasn't much, but it had walls. Aaron nodded, clutching his shoulder. 1, 2, 3. We bolted down the creek bed just as something massive landed behind us. It had jumped down into the creek. I didn't look back, but I could hear it coming after us, its feet pounding the dry creek bed. The tobacco shed loomed ahead. This old grey wooden structure my grandfather hadn't used in years. We scrambled up the bank and sprinted for it. Aaron reached the door first and yanked it open. I dove inside right behind him, and we slammed the door shut. There was no lock, so we dragged an old metal barrel in front of it. The shed was dark except for fading light coming through cracks in the wooden slats. It smelled like old tobacco, dust, and mildew. "What the fuck is that thing?" Aaron gasped, still holding his shoulder. "I don't know," I said. But I did know. We both did. We just couldn't say it out loud because it sounded insane. We stood there in silence for maybe 30 seconds, straining to hear. Had it followed us? Did it know where we were? Then we heard it, heavy breathing outside the shed. Slow footsteps circling the building. The walls were just old wooden planks nailed to a frame with gaps between them. I could see outside through one of the cracks, but only a small patch of ground. The footsteps stopped. Then came a sound like someone smelling the air. Long, deep inhalations. "It can smell us," Aaron whispered. The shed was maybe 15 by 15 feet, with a high ceiling for hanging tobacco. There were old shelves along one wall and some farming tools hanging up. I grabbed a rusty pitchfork, and Aaron found a piece of broken metal pipe. The creature circled the shed once more, then stopped at the far wall, the one furthest from the door. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then the wall exploded inward. Massive hands with long fingers ripped through the wooden planks like they were cardboard. Splinters flew everywhere. I caught a glimpse of reddish-brown hair, muscle, and then part of a face with dark eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Aaron screamed. I'm pretty sure I did too. We abandoned the barrel blocking the door and ran for it. Aaron yanked the door open and we burst outside. The sun had almost set now, and twilight made everything look blue and unreal. We ran blindly toward the house, not daring to look back. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the remaining wall of the shed and coming after us again. Its footsteps were so heavy, I swear I could feel the ground shaking. The house seemed impossibly far away, but we could see the porch light now. A tiny yellow beacon in the growing darkness. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like rubber, but pure terror kept me running. When we were about 100 yards from the house, the footsteps behind us slowed. I risked a glance back and saw it standing at the edge of the yard, where the mowed grass met the field. It was just standing there, watching us. Even in the dim light, I could see how massive it was, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. We made it to the porch, tripping up the steps and bursting through the front door. My grandmother jumped up from her chair, startled. "Lord, what's gotten into you boys?" she asked. We were both gasping for breath, unable to speak. My grandfather came in from the kitchen. There's something out there," I finally managed to say. "Something big," Aaron added. "It chased us. It tore apart the tobacco shed." My grandparents exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "You boys been listening to too many stories," my grandfather said, but there was something in his voice that didn't sound convinced. We tried to explain what we'd seen, but it came out jumbled and crazy sounding. My grandfather finally agreed to get his shotgun and check the property, but he wouldn't go all the way to the shed in the dark. He stood on the porch, shined his powerful flashlight around the yard, and declared there was nothing there. I barely slept that night. Every noise made me jump. I kept picturing those hands ripping through the wooden wall, those eyes reflecting the light. The next morning, my grandfather Aaron and I walked out to the tobacco shed. In the daylight, everything seemed normal, safe, but when we reached the shed, there was no denying what we saw. The back wall was destroyed. Not just damaged. Multiple planks were completely torn away, with others broken and hanging. Inside, things were scattered everywhere. The barrel we'd used to block the door was dented on one side, like something had thrown it against the wall. And around the shed were footprints, huge footprints pressed deep into the soft ground. They were roughly foot-shaped but massive, at least 15 inches long. Some showed clear toe impressions. My grandfather stood there for a long time, just staring at those prints. Finally, he said, "We don't talk about this to your grandmother or your parents." "What was it, Grandpa?" I asked. He shook his head. "Some things in these woods are best left alone. Some of the old-timers call it the wood ape. Others have different names." That was all he would say about it. We spent the rest of my visit fixing the shed, and neither my grandfather nor Aaron would discuss what happened again. That was 20 years ago. I've never gone back to those woods. Sometimes I tried to convince myself it was a bear, or we were just scared teenagers with overactive imaginations. But then I remember those eyes, those hands tearing through solid wood, and I know what I saw. I still can't explain why it stopped at the edge of the yard. Maybe it was the light, or maybe it had some boundary it wouldn't cross. All I know is that whatever lives in those Louisiana woods isn't just a legend, and it's not friendly. Story 4: I still don't know why I'm sharing this after almost 2 years of keeping my mouth shut. Maybe writing it down will help me process what happened. My buddies and I made a pact not to talk about it, but I can't stop thinking about that night in the Oki Mountains. It was August 2021, and 4 of us, me, my brother Mark, and our 2 friends Dave and Kyle, had been planning our annual elk hunting trip for months. We'd been going to different spots in Oregon for years, but this was our first time in the Oki Mountains. We'd heard good things about the elk population there, and the remoteness appealed to us. We'd set up camp in this beautiful little drainage, about 2 miles from the nearest dirt road. The spot was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by dense pines with a creek about 50 yards away. We'd hiked all our gear in and established a comfortable setup with 2 tents, a fire pit, and a tarp-covered area for cooking and gear storage. The first 3 days were completely uneventful. We'd wake up before dawn, split into pairs, and spend all day tracking and scouting. We hadn't taken any elk yet, but we'd seen promising signs and were optimistic. The weather was perfect, warm days, cool nights, and clear skies. On the 4th day, the day everything went to hell, we'd spent another long day in the woods. Mark and I had found fresh elk droppings and some tracks, so our spirits were high, despite being exhausted. We got back to camp around dusk, maybe 7:30 or so. Dave and Kyle had returned about an hour earlier and already had a fire going and coffee brewing. We were sitting around the fire, eating dinner and planning the next day's hunt, when we heard it. This low, rumbling growl from the ridge, about 75 yards from our camp. It wasn't a bear growl. I've heard those before. This was deeper, longer, and honestly it made the hair on my arms stand up instantly. "What the hell was that?" Dave whispered, freezing with his fork halfway to his mouth. We all went quiet, straining to hear any other sounds. Mark grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the ridge, but all we could see were trees and shadows. "Probably just a bear," Kyle said, but he didn't sound convinced. We tried to go back to eating, but we were all on edge. That's when the first rock hit, a fist-sized stone that crashed down about 10 feet from our tent. It wasn't just rolling down the slope. This thing came in at an angle, like it had been thrown. Before we could even react, there was another growl, this time from the opposite side of our camp. We all jumped up, grabbing flashlights and our rifles. Something was surrounding us. "Hello?" Mark called out. "Anyone there?" Silence for about 30 seconds. Then another rock came flying in, this one landing right in our fire, sending sparks everywhere. This wasn't some random natural occurrence. These rocks were being aimed at us, at our tent, at our fire. "I don't like this," I said, my voice barely steady. "Something's not right." We stood back to back, scanning the darkness beyond our campfire's light. That's when we started hearing it. Slow, deliberate movements in the underbrush. Heavy footfalls that would stop whenever we pointed our lights in their direction. "If someone's out there, show yourself," Dave shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "We're armed." Nothing. Then another rock, bigger this time, slammed into our cooler, knocking it over. Kyle raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound was deafening in the quiet forest. For a moment, everything went silent. I remember thinking, thank God we scared it off. But that relief lasted about 30 seconds. From across the drainage, maybe 200 yards away, came the most horrifying sound I've ever heard. A scream that started low and rose to this blood-curdling pitch that didn't sound like anything human or any animal I've ever encountered. It was loud enough that we all instinctively covered our ears. And then, this is what really got us, another scream answered it from farther down the canyon. There were 2 of them. "What the fuck is that?" Kyle whispered, his voice cracking. "We need to get out of here," Dave said, already moving toward the tent to grab his pack. "It's pitch black," Mark argued. "We'd never make it 2 miles through these woods in the dark with whatever those things are out there." He was right. We were trapped until morning. We kept our lights moving, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it, just for a second, as my beam passed between two pines about 40 yards out, a tall, wide figure moving quickly between the trees. It was covered in what looked like dark hair, and its arms, God, its arms hung down almost to its knees. I only saw it for a split second, but that image is burned into my brain. Did you see that? I gasped, pointing. See what? Mark asked. But his question was cut short by the sound of breaking branches, loud cracks that sounded like small trees being snapped in half. More rocks came flying in, one after another, some small, some the size of bowling balls. One narrowly missed Kyle's head. We huddled closer to the fire, backs to each other, rifles ready. I was shaking so bad I could barely hold my flashlight steady. We should make a run for it, Dave whispered. No way, Mark hissed back. That's exactly what they want. To get us away from the fire, away from our light. As if to emphasize his point, one of them, I'm still not sure what else to call them, moved closer. I could see it more clearly this time as it approached within about 30 feet of our camp. It stayed just at the edge of where our light faded, but I could make out its massive frame. It had to be over 8 feet tall, with a relatively small head set on broad shoulders. Its chest was enormous and its legs looked thick and powerful. Jesus Christ, Kyle breathed beside me. Is that what I think it is? None of us wanted to say the word. It seemed ridiculous, impossible. But what else could it be? What else would be 8 feet tall, covered in hair, with a body shape like that? For almost 2 hours, they circled our camp. I say they because we could hear them on different sides, communicating with each other through these guttural growls and occasional wood knocks, sharp cracking sounds like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat. They'd throw rocks, then branches, then entire logs. They'd step heavily just beyond our light's reach, making sure we knew they were there. At one point, around 10:30, we heard what sounded like a tree being pushed over, a creaking, cracking sound followed by a tremendous crash. It couldn't have been more than 50 yards from us. They're trying to scare us, Mark said, his voice remarkably calm given the situation. If they wanted to hurt us, they would have by now. I wasn't so sure. The way they were systematically testing our defenses, closing in from different angles, it felt calculated, intelligent. And that's what terrified me the most. Around 11, the activity reached its peak. They were throwing rocks constantly, growling almost non-stop, and we could hear heavy footfalls circling our camp perimeter. One of them let out another of those horrifying screams, so close it made my ears ring. Kyle was praying quietly beside me. Dave hadn't spoken in over an hour, just standing there with his rifle pointed out into the darkness. Mark kept talking, trying to keep us calm, saying things like, just a few more hours till dawn and they'll get bored eventually. Finally, around midnight, the sounds began to fade. The rock throwing stopped. The footsteps grew more distant. By 12:30, the forest had returned to its normal nighttime sounds, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. None of us slept. We kept the fire roaring all night, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. We barely spoke, just sat there, waiting for dawn, each lost in our own thoughts about what we'd experienced. When the first light finally broke through the trees around 5:30, I felt this wave of relief wash over me. We'd made it through the night. But that relief disappeared as soon as we started looking around our camp. The entire perimeter was littered with broken branches, not just small sticks, but limbs as thick as my arm, snapped like twigs. Rocks of all sizes were scattered everywhere, some having torn through our tarp. The ground around our camp showed fresh impressions, wide areas of pressed-down vegetation where something heavy had stood. But it was what we found about 40 yards from camp that finally broke our silence. A set of footprints pressed deep into the soft soil near the creek. They were massive, over 15 inches long and incredibly wide. The depth of the impressions suggested whatever made them weighed hundreds of pounds. And they weren't bear tracks. These clearly showed 5 toes and a distinct heel. We didn't even discuss it. We just started packing up, working silently and efficiently. Within an hour, we had everything loaded up and were hiking back to our trucks. Nobody wanted breakfast. Nobody wanted to stay a minute longer than necessary. On the hike out, we finally started talking about what had happened, what we'd seen, what we'd heard. We all agreed on one thing. We'd been surrounded and harassed by at least 2 Sasquatch. There was simply no other explanation that fit. We made a pact in the parking lot not to tell anyone. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be laughed out of town, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know I'm never going back to that canyon again. Sometimes I still wake up hearing those screams, feeling those rocks thud into the ground around me. I've been hunting all my life, been in the woods more times than I can count, and never felt fear like I did that night. It wasn't just fear of danger, it was the terror of realizing that something exists out there that shouldn't, that can't be explained. And knowing that for one night we weren't the hunters anymore, we were the prey. Story 5. I've spent my whole life in the Yukon. The winter of 2018 is one I'll never forget, and honestly, I'm still not sure I want to talk about it, but keeping it bottled up is driving me crazy. I need to get this out. I'm a trapper by trade, have been for almost 15 years now. I run lines near Ross River, about 100 miles northeast of Whitehorse. It's remote country, the kind where you can go weeks without seeing another human being. Just vast stretches of snow, pine forest and mountains. I love the solitude, or at least I used to. That December was particularly harsh. We'd had record snowfall in November, and temperatures were consistently dipping below -30. I had a small winter shelter about 20 miles from the nearest road, just a basic log cabin I'd built myself over several summers. Nothing fancy, but it had a wood stove, bunk, table, and storage for supplies. It let me stay out checking my lines for days at a time without having to trek all the way back to town. On December 12th, I headed out to check my northeastern line and planned to stay at the cabin for 3 or 4 days. The snow was deep, almost to my knees in some places, even with snowshoes. It took me most of the day just to reach the cabin, and I was looking forward to warming up by the stove. As I came around the final bend in the trail, I knew immediately something was wrong. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the door was missing. At first, I thought maybe the wind had torn it off, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. The place was wrecked, not just damaged, destroyed. The door wasn't just open. It had been ripped completely off its hinges and was lying 10 feet away in the snow. 2 of the main support poles on the porch were snapped like toothpicks. These weren't small poles either. Each was at least 6 inches thick. The force needed to break them. Jesus! I approached slowly, my rifle ready. I've dealt with bears breaking into cabins before, but this was different. Something felt off. The hair on my neck was standing up. The destruction inside was even worse. My gear was shredded. Sleeping bag torn to pieces. Food containers crushed and emptied. The small table I'd built was just splinters. My heart sank seeing months of work destroyed. But what really chilled me were the marks on the walls. Deep gouges ran along the interior logs, some of them 7 feet up from the floor. They weren't random. They looked like deliberate claw marks, dragged horizontally across the wood. I've hunted every animal in these woods, and I've never seen anything make marks like that. Too high for a bear, unless it was standing, but the pattern was all wrong. I backed out of the cabin, suddenly feeling exposed. That's when I noticed the tracks in the snow. They circled the entire cabin, human-shaped footprints, but massive, easily 15 or 16 inches long and sunk deep into the snow. Whatever made them was heavy, very heavy, and they weren't boots. I could make out what looked like toes. I followed one set of prints about 30 yards into the tree line before they disappeared into thicker forest. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. These weren't human tracks, and they weren't from any animal I recognized. It was getting dark, and the temperature was dropping fast. I had no choice but to try and salvage what I could from the cabin. I couldn't stay there, not with the door torn off and most of my supplies ruined, but I needed enough gear to make it back to my truck the next day. I worked quickly, gathering what wasn't destroyed and piling it near the entrance. I used my small camp stove to heat some water and made a miserable meal of the few food items that weren't ruined. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Every creak of the damaged cabin, every gust of wind had me spinning around, pointing my flashlight into the darkness. I spent that night huddled in the corner of the wrecked cabin, my back against the wall, rifle across my lap. I didn't sleep. Not even for a minute. The temperature dropped to around -25, and without the door, the wind cut right through. I was freezing, despite being in my heaviest gear and wrapped in the remains of a tarp. As the first light of dawn broke, around 9:30 a.m. that far north in December, I started packing the salvageable gear into my backpack. I decided to abandon my trapline for the season. Whatever did this was still out there, and I wasn't about to stick around. I was tying the last bundle together when I heard it. A crack of branches breaking under weight, coming from the tree line to the east of the cabin. I froze, then slowly turned toward the sound, raising my rifle instinctively. There it was, standing between two large spruce trees about 30 yards away. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall. The shoulders had to be twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small guy. Its chest was massive, barrel-shaped, with thick arms hanging at its sides. It was covered in dark hair. Not fur exactly, but hair, mostly dark brown or black, with lighter patches near the shoulders that looked almost reddish in the morning light. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice. The face wasn't completely covered in hair. Dark skin stretched across high cheekbones. Its nose was flat, almost pushed in, with large nostrils, and its mouth... God, its mouth was wide, lips thin. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then it started walking toward me, not charging, just walking deliberately through the snow. Each step sank deep, and I realized whatever this thing was, it had to weigh at least 500 or 600 pounds. I raised my rifle higher, aiming at its chest, but something kept me from pulling the trigger. Fear, maybe. Or some deep instinct telling me that shooting would only make things worse if I didn't drop it with the first shot. It kept coming until it was maybe 15 yards away, close enough that I could hear it breathing, a deep, rumbling sound from its chest. Close enough that I could smell it, a strong, musky odor, unlike anything I've ever encountered. That's when it made the first sound, a low growling that seemed to come from deep in its throat. Not aggressive exactly, but territorial. It opened its mouth slightly and I saw its teeth. They weren't fangs like a predator's. They were more like human teeth but larger, squarer. The canines were bigger than a person's, but not as pronounced as a bear's or wolf's. I've never felt so small, so completely vulnerable. I've faced down charging moose, had close calls with grizzlies, but this was different. This thing was intelligent. I could see it in its eyes. Dark and deeply set under a heavy brow, it was assessing me, deciding what to do. Suddenly it made a bark-like sound, short and sharp, followed by a vocalization I still hear in my nightmares. It was deep, resonating, almost like the lowest note on a pipe organ, but with a quality that made the air around me vibrate. I felt it more than heard it. After that, it just turned and walked away. Not running, not afraid, just calmly turning its back on me and walking between the trees. I watched as it disappeared into the forest, its dark form blending with the shadows until it was gone. I stood there shaking for several minutes, unable to move. When I finally got my legs working again, I grabbed my pack and started moving as fast as I could through the snow, back toward where my truck was parked. The journey back was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Every sound made me jump. I made the trip in record time, practically running the last few miles. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and sat in the cab with the engine running and heater blasting for almost an hour before I could stop shaking enough to drive. I haven't been back to that trap line since. I've spent countless hours researching what I saw. The closest description I can find is what people call a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I know. I would have laughed at anyone telling this story before it happened to me. What keeps me up at night isn't just the memory of what I saw, it's the realization that it could have killed me easily. It was powerful enough to tear apart my cabin, to snap support beams like they were nothing. But it let me go. It made its presence known, marked its territory, and then just walked away. Sometimes I think about going back, maybe with other people, to look for evidence. But then I remember standing there, feeling completely powerless as that thing stared at me, and I know I never will. The Yukon wilderness feels different to me now. It's not just remote and beautiful, it's hiding things most people never see and probably shouldn't. I still trap, but closer to town now, I still find myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement that doesn't belong. And on cold winter nights, when the wind makes the right kind of sound against my window, I remember that deep, vibrating call, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching. Story 6. I've been an avid hunter since '75. I've spent countless hours in the forests of Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and California tracking deer. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, and all manner of wildlife. I've weathered storms, gotten lost, and had my fair share of near misses. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, has ever unnerved me like what happened in the Trinity Shasta National Forest 3 years ago. I'm 38 now, but this happened when I was 35. My twin brother Dan lives near Arcata, California, and I try to visit him at least once a year for a hunting trip. Dan knows the area like the back of his hand, and he'd been telling me about some monster bucks he'd spotted in the Trinity Shasta Forest. So naturally, I drove down from Portland for a weekend hunt. We set out early that morning in Dan's beat-up Ford F-150. The truck smelled like gun oil and stale coffee, just like every hunting trip we'd ever taken. The forest was especially beautiful that time of year, early October, with the leaves just starting to turn. Perfect deer season. We parked at a trailhead Dan was familiar with, grabbed our gear, and hiked about 2 miles into the forest. Dan carried his Remington 308, and I had my trusty .270 Winchester that I'd owned for 15 years. We were both wearing full camo and orange safety vests. Standard stuff. For most of the day, we stuck together, moving quietly through the underbrush, looking for sign. We found plenty of droppings and some promising tracks, but no deer. Around 4 in the afternoon, Dan suggested we split up to cover more ground before dusk. "I'll take the trail down into the canyon," he said, pointing to a narrow jeep path that wound down the hillside. "You set up on that hairpin turn above the creek. It's a natural funnel point. Deer come up from the water and cross right there." I nodded, checked my ammo, and we parted ways. The spot Dan had suggested was perfect. A slight clearing on a ridge overlooking a sharp bend in the trail with a creek bed about 20 yards below. I had good visibility in 3 directions and a thick stand of ferns and Douglas firs at my back. I settled in against the base of a large pine tree, rifle across my lap, and prepared for the wait. The forest was active at first, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Normal forest sounds. But after about 20 minutes, everything went quiet. Dead quiet. I've experienced this before. Sometimes when a predator is moving through an area, everything else goes silent. Usually, it means a mountain lion or coyote is passing through. But this silence felt different, heavier somehow, more complete. That's when I felt it. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. You know that feeling when someone is staring at you? That prickly sensation that crawls up your spine? This was that. but amplified by 100, something was watching me. I was absolutely certain of it. I slowly turned my head to look behind me, into the dark wall of ferns and trees. Nothing, just shadows and undergrowth. But the feeling persisted. I scanned the tree line again, more carefully this time, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of color that didn't belong. Still nothing. I tried to shake it off. Just nerves, I told myself. Just your imagination playing tricks. But I couldn't dismiss it. The feeling was too strong, too real. Something was there, hidden in the forest, watching me. For 5 minutes this continued. The silence, the prickling sensation, the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone. I kept checking behind me, kept scanning the tree line, kept telling myself I was being ridiculous. I'm not a jumpy person. I don't get spooked easily. But I was spooked now. No question about it. And then it happened. The silence was shattered by an enormous crash from below. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my rifle almost tumbling from my lap. My heart hammered in my chest as I scrambled to my feet, weapon at the ready, looking for the source of the noise. It had come from the creek bed below me. I carefully approached the edge of the ridge and looked down. There, in the middle of the nearly dry creek, was a boulder. Not a small rock, a genuine boulder, easily 30 pounds or more. It sat there in the creek bed, surrounded by splashed mud and disturbed gravel, obviously freshly landed. My mind raced. Had it fallen naturally? No, there was no cliff face above the creek, just the gentle slope of the forest floor. Someone, or something, had thrown that rock, and thrown it hard. I spun around, scanning the forest behind me with renewed intensity. The boulder must have sailed right over my head before crashing into the creek bed. The strength required to throw something that heavy, that far, it wasn't human. No way. "Dan!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive silence. No response. The silence returned, somehow even deeper than before. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just me, my pounding heart, and whatever was lurking in those woods. I waited another few minutes, frozen in place, rifle clutched so tightly my knuckles were white. Nothing else happened. No more rocks, no sounds, no movement. But the feeling of being watched never faded. I'd had enough. Buck or no buck, I wasn't staying in that spot another minute. I began backing away, keeping my eyes on the tree line and my rifle ready. I didn't turn my back to the forest until I reached the jeep trail. And even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder as I hustled back toward the truck. The walk back felt like an eternity. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. The forest that had seemed so familiar and comfortable that morning now felt alien and threatening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that whatever had thrown that rock was pacing me just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. When I finally reached the truck, I was drenched in sweat, despite the cool October air. I unlocked it, threw my rifle in and jumped in the driver's seat. Only then did I realize Dan still had the keys. I was trapped there, sitting in the cab. I couldn't leave. As I waited for my brother, my mind kept replaying what had happened. Could it have been Dan playing a prank? It seemed unlikely. We liked to mess with each other, sure, but we took hunting seriously. Plus, Dan had headed down into the canyon, in the opposite direction from where the rock had come from. And no human I knew could throw a 30-pound boulder that distance. A bear, maybe. But bears don't throw rocks. Mountain lion? Same problem. There was only one explanation that kept surfacing in my mind, as much as I tried to dismiss it. The locals around Arcata sometimes talked about Bigfoot sightings in the Trinity Shasta forest. I'd always written those stories off as tall tales or misidentified bears. But now, sitting alone in that truck as the daylight faded, those stories didn't seem so far-fetched. I waited for almost 40 minutes before I saw Dan emerging from the trail. I felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost dizzying. He approached the truck, looking annoyed. "Didn't see a damn thing," he said as he climbed in. "You?" "Dan. Did you circle back behind me at any point? I asked immediately. He looked at me strangely. What? No, I went straight down into the canyon like I told you. Why? I told him what had happened, the silence, the feeling of being watched, the massive rock crashing into the creek bed. As I spoke, his expression changed from confusion to concern. You're serious? He asked when I finished. Dead serious. Something threw a boulder that nearly hit me. It had to weigh at least 30 pounds. Dan was quiet for a moment. I was at least half a mile away, down in the canyon the whole time. Wasn't me. I know it wasn't you, I said. No human could throw a rock that size that far. We sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging in the air between us. You think it was a... Dan didn't finish the question. I don't know what it was, I replied honestly. But I know what I experienced. Dan started the truck, and we drove back to his place, mostly in silence. That night, over beers, he told me that there had been stories about Bigfoot in those woods for generations. Local hunters reported rocks being thrown, strange howls in the night, footprints too large to be human. I'd heard similar stories before, but now they hit differently. I've been back to visit Dan several times since then, but I haven't returned to the Trinity Shasta forest. I still hunt. I was out in the Cascades just last weekend, but I approach the woods differently now, more cautiously, more aware. I don't know for certain what was watching me that day, or what threw that boulder. I can't prove anything, but I know what I felt and I know what I saw. Something was in those woods. Something powerful, intelligent, and definitely not human. Something that wanted me to know it was there, that I was in its territory. I've replayed that afternoon in my mind countless times, wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed longer, if the rock had hit me, if whatever threw it had decided to show itself. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of the hunt or some unnoticed gas leak from the truck had caused me to hallucinate. But then I remember the sound of that rock hitting the creek bed, the splash of mud, the absolute certainty that I was being watched. Whatever it was real, and it's still out there, in those quiet, ancient forests of Northern California, watching and waiting. Story 7. I've been debating whether to share this for years now. Every time I start typing it out, I delete everything and close my laptop. What's the point, right? No one will believe me anyway. But it's been 8 years, and I still can't shake what happened that day. I need to get this off my chest, even if most of you think I'm crazy or making this up. I'm not. I wish I was. It was the second Saturday of August in 2015, the kind of perfect summer day that makes you grateful to be alive. 75 degrees, sunny, with just enough breeze to keep you from sweating. My husband Marcus and I had been cooped up all week with work stress, and we desperately needed to get out of the house. Let's take the bike out, Marcus had suggested that morning over coffee. We lived in southwest Wisconsin at the time, where the countryside is nothing but rolling hills, dense woods, and farmland that stretches for miles. Perfect motorcycle territory. I remember being excited as I put on my riding gear, jeans, boots, my favorite leather jacket, even though it was too warm for it. I've always been overly cautious on the bike. Marcus teases me about it, but I'd rather be sweaty than scraped up on the pavement. We headed out around 11 in the morning with no real destination in mind. That was always our favorite kind of ride. Just us, the open road, and wherever it took us. We rode north of Wildcat Mountain State Park, taking back roads I couldn't name if I tried. The kind where you might pass 1 or 2 cars in an hour. The asphalt was dry and smooth beneath us. Marcus kept it around 40 miles per hour, fast enough to feel the rush, but slow enough to take in the scenery. I remember feeling so at peace on the back of that bike, my arms wrapped around my husband's waist, watching the landscape change from dense forest to open fields and back again. We'd been riding for maybe an hour and a half when it happened. We were on a stretch of road completely lined with trees on both sides. The forest was particularly thick there, with patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy and dappling the pavement. The road curved gently ahead of us. I was looking at the tree line on the right side of the road, just taking in the scenery, when I noticed something that seemed out of place. At first glance, I thought it was a burnt tree stump, one of those blackened, twisted things that sometimes remains after a forest fire, except there hadn't been any fires in the area that I knew of. As we got closer, my brain started scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. The stump had a shape to it that wasn't tree-like at all. It was broader at the top, narrower at the bottom, and it was standing just a few feet from the edge of the pavement. I remember feeling my heart start to race before my conscious mind had even processed what I was looking at. That gut-level, something's wrong feeling hit me hard. Then we were close enough for me to see it clearly. It wasn't a stump. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was, I don't even know how to describe it without sounding insane. It was standing completely upright, perfectly still, right at the edge of the woods. From my position on the back of the bike, I had a clear view of its entire right side. The proportions were all wrong for a human, much larger and wider than any person I've ever seen. Its chest was massive, easily twice as broad as Marcus's, and he's not a small guy. The arms hung down past its waist, with fingers that seemed unnaturally long, reaching almost to its knees. The whole body was covered in dark brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like hair that was about 3 inches long. It wasn't shaggy or matted like you might expect from an animal. It was thick but uniform, and underneath you could see the outline of muscles. Real, defined muscles like you'd see on a bodybuilder, but proportioned differently. But it was the face that made me forget to breathe. The hair there was sparser, revealing skin underneath that was surprisingly light-colored. It had these high cheekbones and a nose that was flat and broad, nothing like a human nose. Its lips were thin, stretched in a straight line across the lower part of its face. The eyes were angled downward, deep set under a pronounced brow ridge that jutted out from its forehead. The head itself was large and slightly rounded at the back. But the thing that struck me most was that it seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. There was no neck, or at least not one I could see from that angle. We passed by it in seconds. Marcus didn't even slow down, because he didn't see it. The thing never moved, never turned its head, never acknowledged us in any way. It just stood there, perfectly still, like it was waiting for something or watching something, just not us. I remember squeezing Marcus's waist so hard he actually shouted back at me, asking if I was okay. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even process what I'd just seen. My mind was racing, trying to categorize it, to fit it into some framework that made sense. But nothing did. I kept thinking, that was a Bigfoot. I just saw a Bigfoot in broad daylight. But even as I thought it, another part of my brain was saying, that's impossible. Those don't exist. Marcus felt me shaking and pulled over about a mile down the road. "What's wrong?" he asked, flipping up his visor. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words sounded ridiculous even to me. I saw something back there, standing in the woods. It wasn't human. He laughed, thinking I was joking. When he realized I was serious, his expression changed to concern. Like what? A bear? No, I said. Much bigger. Standing upright. It had arms and a face. He frowned. "You want to go back and check it out?" I didn't. Every instinct was screaming at me to get as far away as possible, but I also needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind, so I nodded. We turned around and headed back the way we came. The whole time, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. What would we do if it was still there? What if it wasn't alone? What if it wasn't friendly? It took about 20 minutes to get back to that same stretch of road. I recognized the curve, the pattern of trees. Marcus slowed the bike down to almost a crawl. "Where was it?" he asked. I pointed to the spot. Right there, just off the road. There was nothing there. No creature, no footprints, no broken branches. Nothing to indicate that anything had ever stood in that spot. Marcus cut the engine, and we sat there for a moment in silence. "Are you sure this is the right place?" he asked. I was positive. I could still picture exactly where it had been standing. But now, in the absence of evidence, doubt started creeping in. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of light and shadow? Maybe a weirdly shaped tree that my mind had transformed into something more sinister? But I knew what I'd seen. The details were too specific, too clear. The way its muscles moved slightly under that brown hair as we passed by. The curve of its broad back. Those unnervingly long fingers. The flat, expressionless face with eyes that didn't track our movement. We sat there for maybe 10 minutes while Marcus humored me, looking around for any sign of whatever I'd seen. Eventually, he suggested we continue our ride, and I agreed. What else could we do? The rest of the day was ruined for me. I couldn't enjoy the scenery anymore. Every shadow in the woods became a potential hiding place for more of these creatures. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see another one watching us. The peaceful countryside that I'd always loved suddenly felt alien and threatening. When we got home that evening, I immediately went online and started researching Bigfoot sightings in Wisconsin. I'd never given much thought to cryptids or conspiracy theories before, but now I was desperate for validation. I needed to know I wasn't the only one who had seen something like this. I found dozens of accounts, some from areas not far from where we'd been riding. Many described creatures similar to what I'd seen: the broad shoulders, the lack of a visible neck, the long arms, but none of them mentioned the absolute stillness that had made my sighting so unnerving. This thing hadn't moved a muscle as we approached and passed by. It was like it was frozen in place, or so focused on something else that our presence didn't register at all. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face. Not angry or aggressive, just completely impassive, inhuman. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had been a hallucination or a misidentification. Maybe I was more tired than I'd realized. Maybe it was just a weird play of light and shadow. But deep down, I knew better. We never went back to that specific area again. Marcus suggested another ride in that direction a few weeks later, and I made up an excuse about work. I couldn't bring myself to tell him that I was terrified of seeing that thing again, or worse, of seeing more of them. I still don't know what I saw that day. Logic tells me it couldn't have been a Bigfoot because Bigfoot isn't supposed to exist. But I know what I saw wasn't human, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I can explain. 8 years later, and I still get chills thinking about how close we came to it. How easily it could have stepped out onto the road in front of us. How vulnerable we were on that motorcycle, miles from the nearest town or cell service. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, standing motionless among the trees, watching as people pass by, completely unaware of its presence. And sometimes, on dark nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's watching me now. Story 8. I've never been one for tall tales. I've spent my whole life in northeastern Nebraska, and folks around here value honesty. But what I saw that fall evening in '74 has haunted me for decades, and I need to finally put it in writing, even if some won't believe me. I was 26 back then, an experienced bow hunter who knew every ridge and ravine along the Niobrara River. That particular day in mid-October started like any other hunting trip. The weather was perfect. Crisp autumn air with temperatures in the low 50s, leaves just starting to turn those deep oranges and reds. I'd taken the day off from my construction job to get some hunting in before the season peaked. I'd spent most of the afternoon in my usual spot about 3 miles west of town. The deer weren't moving, though. After sitting motionless for nearly 4 hours with nothing to show for it but a stiff back and cold fingers, I decided to try my luck elsewhere. I packed up my gear, just my compound bow, a quiver of arrows, my buck knife, and a small pack with some jerky and water. and headed back to my old Ford pickup. It was getting on toward 5 o'clock, and I figured I had maybe an hour and a half of decent light left. I decided to check out an area about 5 miles east of town that I didn't hunt as often, but knew had good potential. It had these dirt bluffs rising up on the south side of the river and thick woods in the floodplain to the north, perfect deer habitat. As I drove slowly along the country road paralleling the river, I kept scanning the ravines that cut into those bluffs. The setting sun was casting long shadows, and this time of evening is when deer often start moving from their bedding areas to feeding spots. I wasn't hunting from the road, that would have been illegal, but I was looking for a promising place to park and hike in for the last hour of daylight. About 5 miles east of town, I spotted a particularly deep ravine that looked promising. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, grabbed my bow and backpack, and walked to the edge where I could get a better view down into it. The ravine was maybe 30 yards wide at the top, narrowing as it descended toward the river, lined with scrub oak, hackberry trees, and thick brush. Perfect ambush spot for deer coming down to drink. I stood there for maybe a minute, just scanning with my eyes, when something caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the shape was all wrong. Too tall, too broad. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a black Angus that had wandered off from one of the nearby ranches. But no, this was standing upright, about 50 feet away, partially obscured by brush but clearly visible. What I saw next made my blood run cold. It was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. Standing completely upright on 2 legs, covered in thick, coal-black hair, maybe 3 or 4 inches long. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably more. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, maybe 3 feet across, with massive arms hanging down. The thing that struck me most was its face. Not quite human, but definitely not like any animal I'd seen. The face area was a dark tan color, either shorter hair or actual skin, I couldn't tell. But the eyes were dark and deeply set, unmistakably looking right at me with what I can only describe as intelligence. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably just 2 seconds, we locked eyes. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I'd been hunting these woods my entire life and knew every animal native to Nebraska. This wasn't a bear. We don't have them here. It wasn't a man in a suit. No costume could capture the natural muscular bulk and proportion of this thing. Then it moved. In one fluid motion, it turned its entire upper body, not just its head, but shoulders and torso together, like its neck was fused, and began running up the ravine away from me. The way it moved, I'll never forget it. Despite its size, it moved with incredible grace and speed, covering ground faster than any human could, yet making almost no sound. I stood there dumbfounded, watching the muscles in its back and shoulders ripple under that black hair as it bounded up the slope. The strangest part was how quiet it was. Here was this massive creature, I'd estimate at least 300 to 350 pounds, moving through dry autumn leaves and underbrush, yet making barely a sound. No crashing, no breaking branches, just a soft swishing as it disappeared up the ravine and over the ridge. When it vanished from sight, I suddenly realized I'd been holding my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my bow. The rational part of my brain was trying to explain what I'd just seen. A black bear that had wandered far from its territory. Some exotic animal escaped from a private collection. But I knew better. This was something else entirely. I stood frozen for maybe another minute, then fear kicked in. I practically ran back to my truck, threw my gear in the cab, and locked the doors. Something I never did out here. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled to get the key in the ignition. The whole time, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing coming after me. On the drive back to town, my mind was racing. Should I report what I'd seen? To who? The local sheriff would think I was drunk or crazy. My hunting buddies would never let me hear the end of it. I decided to keep it to myself, at least until I could make sense of it. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, intelligent eyes staring back at me, the way it moved, so powerful yet so graceful, the complete silence of its retreat. None of it made sense within my understanding of the natural world. The next morning, curiosity got the better of fear. I drove back out to that same spot, this time bringing my .306 rifle instead of my bow. I parked in the same place and cautiously approached the ravine. In the clear light of day, the woods seemed normal again, the previous evening's encounter almost dreamlike. I worked up the courage to climb down into the ravine, looking for tracks or hair or any evidence of what I'd seen. The ground was mostly dry and rocky, not ideal for tracking, but in one softer patch of earth near where the creature had been standing, I found something that sent chills down my spine, a footprint, or what remained of one. It was mostly collapsed, but I could make out what looked like a massive, human-shaped foot, at least 15 inches long and incredibly wide. It wasn't clear enough to see toe impressions, but the overall shape was unmistakable. It wasn't a bear track, it wasn't an elk or deer track, it was a foot, a massive humanoid foot. I didn't stay long after finding that. The feeling of being watched crept over me, though I never saw anything. I quickly returned to my truck and left, more confused than ever. In the weeks and months that followed, I kept that experience to myself. I continued to hunt that season, but never went back to that particular ravine. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what I'd seen, not my wife, not my hunting buddies, no one. Who would believe me, in northeastern Nebraska of all places? But over the years I started hearing whispers, other stories. In 1978, a rancher about 12 miles southwest of town told me over beers how he'd been checking on his calving heifers one night and seen two upright figures at the edge of his pasture, their eyes reflecting red in his flashlight beam. They'd disappeared into the trees before he could get a good look. He'd never told anyone else for fear of ridicule. In the early 80s, another local claimed he'd seen an 8-foot-tall creature near his chicken coop one morning before dawn. He described the same coal-black hair, the same fluid movement, the same eerie silence I'd experienced. These stories gave me some comfort. I wasn't alone in what I'd seen, but they also confirmed my decision to keep quiet. In small-town Nebraska, being known as the guy who claimed to see monsters wasn't a reputation I wanted. Years passed. I still hunted those same woods, but never had another clear sighting. Until 1995, that is. I was bow hunting again, in a different area about 10 miles west of my original encounter. I was in a tree stand at dusk, when suddenly every bird and insect around me went silent. The woods became unnaturally still. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched. I scanned the forest floor below me, the surrounding trees, but saw nothing. Yet the feeling was undeniable. Something was there, observing me. After about 15 minutes, the normal sounds of the forest gradually returned, and the sensation faded. I don't know what to make of what I saw that day in '74, or what I felt in '95. I'm not a superstitious man. I don't believe in ghosts or UFOs or most of that paranormal stuff. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. Some nights, I still wake up remembering those eyes looking into mine, that moment of mutual recognition, before it turned and vanished into the Nebraska wilderness. Whatever it was intelligent. It knew I had seen it, and it chose to leave rather than confront me. I'm 68 years old now. I still hunt those same woods, though more with a camera these days than a bow. I've never had another clear sighting, but sometimes when I'm alone in the forest at dusk, I feel that same prickle on the back of my neck, that same sense of being observed. And I wonder if it's still out there watching and waiting, keeping to the shadows where most people never think to look. Story 9. I've been debating whether to share this for months. I'm not someone who believes in the paranormal or gets spooked easily. I'm a logical person, always have been. But what I saw that night in January has been eating at me, and I need to get it off my chest. I work at the manufacturing plant just outside Black River Falls, Wisconsin. Been there about 4 years now. The night shift pays better, so I usually work from 4 in the afternoon until midnight. The drive home is always quiet, rarely see another car that time of night, especially in winter. It was January 17th, 2023. I remember the date clearly because I'd been complaining to my co-workers about having to file my quarterly taxes soon. The temperature had dropped to about 15 below zero that night. My car's heater was struggling, and I was exhausted after a 10-hour shift. All I wanted was to get home, shower, and crash. It was around 12:40 in the morning when it happened. I was about 7 minutes into my 20-minute drive home on that stretch of County Road A before it connects to the 4-lane highway. You know the area if you're from around here. Dense forest on both sides, no street lights, steep embankments, no houses for at least 2 miles in either direction. Just wilderness. My high beams were on because it was pitch black out there. The moon was covered by clouds, and there wasn't a single light source besides my headlights. I was going about 55 miles per hour, just under the speed limit because of the ice patches on the road. I came around this gentle curve. There's that spot where the trees open up a bit on the right side, when my headlights swept across something standing in the opposite lane. At first, my brain tried to categorize it. Person? No. Deer? No. Bear? Definitely not. It was tall, taller than any person I've ever seen, maybe 7, 8 feet, and it was completely black. Not like African-American black, but absence of light black. Like it was absorbing my headlights rather than reflecting them. The figure was standing completely upright, facing away from me, toward the southeast woods. I only saw it for maybe a second as I drove past, but that image is burned into my memory. It had a definite shape. Broad shoulders, a head, arms that hung down longer than a human's would. But what freaks me out most when I think back is how utterly still it was. It didn't flinch when my headlights hit it, didn't turn to look at my car, just stood there in the middle of the opposite lane like it had every right to be there. My foot instinctively hit the brake, but I caught myself and kept driving. Something deep in my gut told me not to stop, not to look back, just keep going. I white-knuckled the steering wheel for the rest of the drive home, kept checking my rearview mirror like I expected to see it following me, but there was nothing but darkness behind me. When I got home, I couldn't shake the image from my head. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hunter in some kind of special gear? At 12:40 a.m., in below freezing temperatures, standing motionless in the middle of a road? I checked the local news the next morning to see if anyone had reported anything strange. Nothing. I even drove back to that spot in daylight the next day, looking for footprints or any sign of what I'd seen. The snowplow had already been through, so the road was clear, and I didn't have the guts to get out and check the woods. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, that my tired brain had conjured up something that wasn't there. Then I remembered that Josh, one of my co-workers, lives in the same direction and usually leaves about 15 minutes before me. I messaged him the next day, trying to sound casual. "Hey, see anything weird on County A last night on your drive home?" His response made my blood run cold. Actually, yeah. There was this deer that bolted across the road right in front of my car near that curve before the highway. Never seen one move so fast, like it was running from something. Had to slam on my brakes. Why? I didn't tell him what I saw. Just said I thought I'd seen some debris on the road and wanted to make sure he got home okay. But the timing, Josh sees a deer running for its life, and 15 minutes later, I see this thing standing in the same area. My mind immediately went to the worst place. Was it tracking the deer, hunting it? The location makes it even weirder. There's nowhere to park a car nearby. The embankments on both sides of the road are steep, like a 15-foot drop. In winter, they're covered with snow and ice. No human would choose to climb up those just to stand in the middle of the road at almost 1 in the morning, and it wasn't dressed for the weather. I didn't see any coat or winter gear, just this solid black figure in 15 below zero temperatures. I've driven that same route hundreds of times since then. Every night I slow down at that curve, my heart pounding, half expecting to see it again. I never have. But I think about it every single time. Last week I finally broke down and told my girlfriend about it. She suggested it might have been a Bigfoot. I almost laughed. I've never believed in that stuff. But then I started researching online, and some of the descriptions match what I saw. Except most Bigfoot sightings describe a brown or reddish creature, not something pitch black like what I saw. I also found some local legends about shadow people, or dark watchers, that stand on roadsides or in forests watching travelers pass. Some of the accounts describe exactly what I saw: unnaturally tall, completely black figures that don't move when spotted. The worst part is the feeling I still can't shake. When I drove past it, I felt noticed, not by it turning to look at me, because it didn't, but somehow I felt like it was aware of me, even though its back was turned, like it had already registered my presence before I even came around that curve. I've tried to find logical explanations. Maybe it was a hunter in a ghillie suit, but who hunts in the middle of the night in January? A stranded motorist? There were no vehicles nearby. A prankster trying to scare drivers? That's a lot of effort for a prank that might not even be seen at that hour. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced it wasn't human. The proportions were wrong. The stillness was wrong. Everything about it felt alien. Not from outer space alien, but not belonging to our world. I've always been the skeptical type. I roll my eyes at ghost stories and cryptid sightings. But this experience has shaken my worldview. I know what I saw, even if it was just for a split second. It was real. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, standing in different spots along dark roads, watching, waiting. For what? I don't know. Part of me wants to see it again, to confirm I'm not crazy. A bigger part hopes I never do. The strangest thing is how normal everything else is. I still go to work. I still drive home on that road. Life continues. But there's this knowledge I carry now, that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist but do. I've started keeping a baseball bat in my car. I've installed extra lights on my vehicle. I don't know if either would help if I encountered that thing again, but they make me feel a little safer. Josh quit his job at the plant last month, moved closer to Milwaukee. When I asked him why, he gave vague answers about better opportunities. But there was something in his eyes that made me wonder if he'd seen something too. Something he wasn't telling me. I still drive that road 5 nights a week. Every time I approach that curve, I slow down. My hands get sweaty, my heart races, and I hold my breath until I'm past it. Nothing has ever been there again. But I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me, that it's waiting, that our paths will cross again someday. What was it? I don't know. Will I ever see it again? God, I hope not. But if you're ever driving through Black River Falls at night, especially on County Road A, keep your eyes open. And if you see something tall and black standing by the roadside, don't stop, don't look back, just keep driving. I still can't explain what I saw that night. Maybe I never will, but I know it was real, and that knowledge has changed me forever. Story 10. It's been nearly 3 decades, but I still get a cold chill whenever I drive that stretch of Highway 101 near Crescent City. I've never told many people about this. My wife Mary still doesn't know, and I plan to keep it that way. She'd either think I was crazy or get so spooked she'd never want to ride with me again. It was August of 1995. I was hauling a load of lumber from Portland down to the Bay Area. Mary liked to come along on these summer runs. She'd always say the cab of my Peterbilt was more comfortable than our living room sofa, and I enjoyed the company on those long hauls. We'd been on the road since early morning. By late afternoon, we were making good time heading south on 101 near Crescent City. The sun was starting to set, casting this golden-orange glow across the Pacific. Mary had dozed off about 20 minutes earlier. She always could sleep through anything. The rumble of the engine, the CB radio static, my terrible singing to whatever came on the radio. I remember every detail of what happened next. The highway runs right along the coast there, and I spotted this little turnout overlooking a beach with black sand. I'd been driving that route for 15 years and had never noticed it before. Something about it just called to me. I wasn't particularly tired, but something in my gut told me to pull over. Maybe it was just the view, or maybe it was something else. I still don't know. I eased the rig into the turnout, set the brake, and let the engine idle. Mary was still sleeping, her head against the passenger window, breathing softly. I was about to wake her to show her the view. The black sand looked almost unreal in the fading light. When I noticed something moving down near the shoreline, at first I thought it was just a bear. We see them all the time, up and down the coast. But then it stood up. Jesus Christ, it stood up. What I saw wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before outside of those blurry photos people claim are Bigfoot. The thing was massive. I'm 6 feet tall myself, and this creature had to be at least 6.5, maybe 7 feet tall. It was covered in this dark brown matted hair, not fur like a bear, more like human hair, but thicker, coarser, and all over its body. The strangest part was that it was carrying something. In both hands, it held what looked like clumps of seaweed or kelp, like it had been harvesting it from the ocean. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, my hands frozen on the steering wheel, watching this thing through my windshield. Then it turned. It must have heard my truck, or maybe it sensed me somehow. It turned and looked directly at me, our eyes locked. I've looked into the eyes of plenty of animals in my life, deer caught in my headlights, bears crossing roads, even a mountain lion once when I was hiking. But this was different. There was intelligence there, awareness. Those eyes were deep set under a heavy brow, dark and human-like, but not human. Definitely not human. The creature seemed angry that I'd interrupted whatever it was doing. Its face. God, its face. The nose was flat and wide, almost like a gorilla's, but more pronounced. Its jaw jutted forward slightly, and I could see teeth when its mouth opened slightly. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I didn't dare move. I didn't even think Mary's presence would help. If anything, I was terrified of her waking up and screaming, potentially provoking this thing. Then it snorted. Not like a dismissive human snort. This was powerful, like a bull or a large horse might make. A spray of mucus hit my windshield. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but somehow managed to stay still, afraid any movement would trigger something worse. The creature then did something I'll never forget. Still holding its seaweed in both hands, it took 3 or 4 deliberate steps, not away from me, but across the highway. The whole time, it maintained eye contact with me. It was like it was making a point. I see you seeing me, and I don't care. Its gait was smooth but odd, longer strides than a human would take, with a slight rock from side to side, but it wasn't awkward. It moved with purpose and confidence. Just as it reached the other side of the highway, I heard the squeal of tires. Another vehicle was approaching fast from the north. The creature turned its head toward the sound, then back at me one last time. In 2 bounds, it disappeared into the tree line on the other side of the road. The approaching car, a red Jeep Cherokee, came to a screeching halt right beside my truck. The driver, a guy maybe in his 30s with a baseball cap, was frantically pointing toward where the creature had vanished and honking his horn. I started my engine immediately. Fight or flight had kicked in, and flight was winning by a mile. I remember checking that Mary was still asleep. Miraculously she was, before pulling back onto the highway, probably faster than I should have with a full load. The Jeep caught up to me about a half-mile down the road, flashing his lights and honking. I was reluctant, but I pulled over. Part of me just wanted to keep driving all the way to San Francisco without stopping, but another part of me needed to know if he'd seen what I'd seen. The guy parked behind me and ran up to my window. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Tell me you saw that." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I saw it." "What the hell was it?" he demanded, looking back over his shoulder like he expected it to come charging out of the woods after us. "I don't know," I said honestly. "What else could I say?" "It was carrying something," he said. "Seaweed or something." That confirmation sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't my imagination. Someone else had seen exactly what I had seen. We talked for maybe 2 minutes, neither of us really knowing what to say. He asked if I was going to report it. I said I didn't know who I'd report it to or what I'd say. He agreed. Who would believe us? "My wife's asleep," I told him, nodding toward Mary. "I'm not even going to tell her. She'd never come with me on another trip." He understood completely. We exchanged first names. His was Todd, but not contact information. It was like we both tacitly agreed that we'd rather just move on and pretend it never happened. He got back in his Jeep and headed south. I followed a few minutes later after taking some deep breaths to steady myself. Mary woke up about 20 minutes later as we were pulling into a truck stop in the next town. She asked why I looked so pale. I told her I was just tired. We got dinner, and I drank 3 cups of coffee, not because I needed the caffeine, but because I needed something normal to hold on to. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes staring back at me. The intelligence in them, the anger. I kept thinking about the seaweed. Why was it collecting seaweed? What was it going to do with it? It seemed so purposeful, like it had a specific reason for being there, a specific task it was performing. The next morning, we continued south. I considered turning on the radio to see if there were any reports of a strange sighting, but I decided against it. Part of me didn't want confirmation. Part of me wanted to believe I'd just seen a very tall, very hairy man doing something weird on the beach. But I knew better. Over the years, I've driven that stretch of 101 of times. I always slow down near where it happened, scanning the tree line, looking for that black sand beach. Sometimes I can find the turnout, sometimes I can't. It's like the landscape shifts, hiding it from me. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes when I'm driving alone at dusk, I get this feeling like I'm being watched from the trees. I've read about Bigfoot sightings since then. Some of them sound like what I saw, others don't. I don't know if what I saw was Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I just know it was real, it was intelligent, and it was doing something specific with that seaweed. I'm 65 now, retired from trucking. Mary and I still take road trips sometimes, but I always find a reason to avoid that specific stretch of Highway 101 when she's with me. When I do drive it alone, I always feel my heart rate pick up as I approach that area. My palms get sweaty on the steering wheel. Sometimes I think I see movement in the trees, but it's probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. Or at least that's what I tell myself. I've never been a believer in the supernatural or cryptids or any of that stuff. I'm a practical man. I believe what I see with my own eyes, what I can touch with my own hands. And I saw something that day that shouldn't exist, but does. Sometimes I wonder if Todd, the guy in the Jeep, ever told anyone. Sometimes I wonder if he's out there somewhere, still thinking about what we saw, still questioning his sanity like I occasionally question mine. The thing that keeps me up at night, even now, isn't just that this creature exists. It's that it was doing something purposeful, gathering, harvesting, that suggests intelligence, planning, maybe even a society of some kind. And if they're out there, living alongside us without most of us knowing, what else don't we know about our world? I've never told Mary. I probably never will. Some things are better left unsaid, especially when there's nothing to be gained from saying them. But sometimes, when we're watching those cryptid hunter shows she likes, and they're talking about Bigfoot, I have to leave the room. I can't bear to hear them debate whether or not these creatures exist. Because I know they do. I've looked one in the eyes, and somehow, that's worse than not knowing. The city. Story 11. I've never really talked about this before, not fully anyway. My name's Johnny, and what happened to me that October day in 1894 still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I'm not one for tall tales or exaggerations. Anyone who knows me from Snowball would tell you I'm as straight as they come. But what I saw that day, well, I still can't make sense of it nearly 30 years later. It was a Tuesday. I remember that, clear as day. The air had that particular crispness you get in October, and the sky was that perfect blue you only see in the Australian bush. I'd been tasked with riding from Snowball to Gingin Post Office to deliver some important documents for my employer, Mr. Dawson. He owned the largest sheep station in the area, and I'd been working for him since I was just a lad of 15. The ride wasn't particularly difficult, about 14 miles of familiar country road that I'd traveled dozens of times before. I set out early that morning on my mare Bessie. She was a steady old girl, not easily spooked, which makes what happened all the more unsettling. I'd packed a small lunch of bread and dried meat and stopped around midday to rest Bessie and have a bite. The morning had been uneventful, just the usual sights and sounds of the bush. Kookaburras laughing in the trees, the occasional kangaroo bounding across the path ahead. Nothing to suggest what was coming. After lunch, I continued on my way. The sun was high overhead now, beating down mercilessly. I remember taking off my hat to wipe the sweat from my brow, cursing the heat under my breath. The road wound through patches of eucalyptus trees and scrubby bush, occasionally opening up to give views across the surrounding countryside. It must have been around 3 in the afternoon when it happened. I was about 4 miles from Gingin, in a section where the road curved gently around a small hill. There was dense woodland on the left side of the road, while the right side opened up to a clearing with scattered trees and fallen logs. Bessie was plodding along steadily, and I was half dozing in the saddle, lulled by the rhythmic movement in the warm afternoon. Then Bessie stopped, just like that. Her ears pricked forward, and I felt her muscles tense beneath me. At first, I thought it might be a snake on the road. Not uncommon in these parts. I gently urged her forward, but she wouldn't budge. That's when I heard it, a sort of rustling sound coming from the clearing to my right. I shaded my eyes against the sun and peered in that direction. At first, I couldn't make out anything unusual, just the usual scrubby bush and fallen timber. But then something moved and my blood ran cold. About 30 yards from the road stood, well, I still don't rightly know what it was. A creature, I suppose you'd call it, but like no creature I'd ever seen before or since. It was tall, a good 6 feet at least, probably more, and covered in coarse dark hair from head to toe. Not fur, mind you, but hair, like a man's but all over. It was built like a bullock with massive shoulders and thick limbs. For a second we just stared at each other, me on Bessie, frozen in shock, and this thing standing motionless among the trees. I remember thinking absurdly that I must be seeing things. Maybe the heat had got to me, or I'd eaten something bad at lunch, but Bessie saw it too. I could feel her trembling beneath me. Then it happened so fast. The creature took a step, and it seemed to catch its foot on a fallen log. It let out a bellow that made my hair stand on end, not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep and throaty, but with an almost human quality that chilled me to the bone. The sound echoed across the clearing, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. That's when it started to move away from me. Not running exactly, at least not at first, but moving at a pace that was faster than a man could walk. What struck me was how it kept looking back at me as it retreated, not with curiosity, but something more deliberate, like it was assessing me. Its eyes, I couldn't make out the color from that distance, but they were deep set under a heavy brow ridge. As it picked up speed, I noticed something else strange. Its feet, or paws, or whatever they were kicking up clouds of dust as it ran. But it wasn't just from impact. It was like its toenails were actually digging into the earth, tearing up the soil as it moved. I've never seen anything like it before or since. I sat there on Bessie, paralyzed. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. My throat had gone dry, and my heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature kept moving, getting further away, until it disappeared into denser woodland about 200 yards away. The whole encounter probably lasted no more than 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. After it vanished, I finally managed to get Bessie moving again. She was reluctant, skittish in a way I'd never seen her. I didn't blame her. I was torn between the urge to flee back the way I'd come and the need to complete my errand. In the end, duty won out, and I continued toward Gingen, though I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it some kind of escaped animal from a traveling circus, a deformed man living wild in the bush? Neither explanation seemed to fit what I'd witnessed. Its movements were too fluid, too natural for it to be a man in some kind of costume. And it was unlike any animal native to Australia that I knew of. When I finally reached Gingen post office, I must have looked a sight. The postmaster, Mr. Collins, took one look at me and asked if I'd seen a ghost. I hesitated, unsure whether to tell him what I'd seen. Would he think I was mad or drunk? But the experience was so vivid, so terrifying, that I couldn't keep it to myself. So I told him. Tried to, anyway. The words tumbled out in a confused rush at first. Mr. Collins sat me down, gave me a cup of strong tea, though I would have preferred something stronger, and asked me to start again from the beginning. I described the creature as best I could. Its height, its build, the coarse hair covering its body. I told him about the bellow it had made after hitting its foot, and how it had torn up the earth with its toenails as it ran. I described the way it had looked back at me repeatedly as it retreated, as if sizing me up. Mr. Collins listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that sent another chill through me. "You're not the first, Johnny." He told me that over the years, there had been scattered reports from travelers and settlers in the region of a hairy, man-like creature in the bush. The Aboriginals had stories too, going back who knows how long, of a being they called different names in different areas. Yawi, Dulagal, Jugabinna, a creature that walked upright like a man, but was covered in hair and lived deep in the wilderness. Most white settlers dismissed these as primitive superstitions, of course. But every now and then, someone would come in with a story like mine, a face-to-face encounter that couldn't be explained away as a misidentified kangaroo or a shadow in the trees. Mr. Collins suggested I report what I'd seen to Constable Peters, which I did, though I could tell the constable was skeptical. He wrote down my account politely enough, but I saw the look he exchanged with his deputy when he thought I wasn't watching. That night, I stayed at the small inn in Gingen. I couldn't face the ride back to Snowball, not with darkness falling and the memory of that creature still so fresh in my mind. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there, staring at me with those deep-set eyes. I heard its bellow echoing in my ears. The next morning, Constable Peters came to see me before I left. He'd been thinking about my report, he said, and wondering if I'd be willing to take him back to the spot where I'd had my encounter. I agreed, though my stomach twisted at the thought. We rode out together, retracing my journey from the previous day. When we reached the curve in the road where it had happened, I pointed out the clearing. "There," I said. "That's where it was standing." We dismounted and walked into the clearing. At first I thought we wouldn't find anything, that there would be no evidence to back up my story. But as we approached the fallen log I'd mentioned, Constable Peters suddenly stopped short. "What's this?" he said, crouching down. In the soft earth beside the log were footprints, but not human footprints and not like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were large, a good 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions, and just as I'd described, there were deep gouges in the soil that could only have been made by substantial claws or nails. Constable Peters didn't say much as he examined the tracks. He made some measurements and notes in his pocketbook. He asked me again about what I'd seen, this time paying closer attention to the details. The skepticism was gone from his manner. Before we left, he took me aside and said something that stayed with me all these years. "Mr. Williams," he said, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak too widely about what you saw yesterday, not until I've had a chance to look into it further." I agreed, but word got out anyway, as it always does in small communities. Some people believed me, others thought I was spinning yarns. A few suggested I'd had too much to drink, though anyone who knew me knew I was never one for the bottle. In the weeks that followed, I heard rumors that others had gone looking for the creature, but no one else reported seeing it. Eventually, the excitement died down and life returned to normal, but I never rode that stretch of road alone again, and I never forgot. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that clearing. The Aboriginals would say it was a yowie. Scientists might call it mass hysteria or misidentification. All I know is what I saw with my own eyes. A hairy, man-like creature that moved like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night and the house is quiet, I still hear that bellow in my mind. I still see those eyes looking back at me as it retreated into the bush. And I wonder if it's still out there somewhere in the vast Australian wilderness, watching and waiting. Story 12. I've never shared this with anyone outside our original group. I'm 38 now, but what happened when I was 12 is still so vivid. I sometimes dream about it. I know what we saw, no matter what anyone else might think. This happened back in 1997 at my parents' place on the outskirts of Bear Hammock Wildlife Management Area in central Florida. We had about 5 acres, mostly grassy clearings with woods surrounding us on 3 sides, and Bear Creek running along the back of the property. Nothing fancy, just a single-story ranch house with a big yard that backed up to wilderness. Perfect for a kid. That summer, I convinced my parents to let me and 3 friends camp out in our yard. We were all 12, except for Tommy, who was 11. The others were my best friend Kyle and brothers Mark and Tommy Larson from down the road. We'd been talking about camping for weeks. Mum made us promise to stay where she could see us from the back porch. We set up our 2 tents about 100 yards from the house, in a clearing with tall grass around it that my dad had mowed just enough for us to have a flat spot. Close enough that we could run back if we needed, but far enough to feel like a real adventure. We spent that afternoon setting up camp, gathering sticks for the fire, and dragging over some logs to sit on. Dad helped us dig a small fire pit and showed us how to build a proper campfire. It was nothing special, just a tiny ring of rocks with some kindling and a few small logs. But to us it was everything. We brought hot dogs and marshmallows and all the typical camping stuff. The sun started to set around 8:30, and that's when the woods really came alive. The cicadas were deafening, and every few minutes we'd hear something rustling in the brush. Probably just raccoons or possums, but it kept us on edge. Kyle had brought his dad's fancy mag light, the big metal one that could blind you if you looked right at it. I had a cheaper plastic flashlight, and the Larson brothers shared one of those lantern-style lights. Everything was going great until around 9:30, when Tommy started getting anxious. He'd never camped outside before, and I think the darkness and all the sounds were getting to him. He kept jumping at every noise and looking back toward the house. "I think I'm gonna head back," Tommy finally said, his voice kind of shaky. Mark tried to convince him to stay, called him a baby and all that, but Tommy was done. "Whatever. Go back to Mommy," Mark said, which was pretty harsh considering they were brothers, but that's how kids are, I guess. Tommy gathered his sleeping bag and backpack. The rest of us stayed by the fire, but I felt bad for him having to walk back alone. It was only 100 yards, but when you're 11 and it's pitch black, except for your flashlight beam, it feels like miles. As Tommy started trudging through the tall grass toward the house, Kyle grabbed his maglite and pointed it at Tommy's back. "Boo!" Kyle shouted, and Tommy jumped, which made us laugh. I picked up my flashlight too and pointed it in Tommy's direction. That's when we saw it. Something was moving through the grass behind Tommy. At first, I thought it was just the grass swaying in the breeze, but there was no breeze. Then I realized it was something big, really big, walking upright through the grass about 20 yards behind Tommy. My blood went cold. Kyle must have seen it too, because he suddenly went quiet. Our flashlight beams converged on the same spot, and for maybe 3 seconds, we both got a clear look at whatever it was. It stood at least 6.5 feet tall, probably taller. It was walking on 2 legs, but hunched forward slightly. Its arms were long, too long, and swung with each step in a way that didn't look human at all. The knees bent outward in a weird way. The whole body was covered in dark, rough-looking hair that hung longer from the arms and around what I guess was its face. Though I couldn't make out any facial features, the thing that really got me was how it moved. Despite its size, it made almost no sound. The grass barely rustled. It crossed the path behind Tommy in just 3 huge steps, then vanished into the darkness beyond our flashlight beams. The whole sighting lasted maybe 5 seconds at most, but it burned itself into my memory forever. Kyle and I looked at each other, both of us wide-eyed. No words needed. We'd both seen the same thing. "Tommy, come back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Tommy turned around, confused. "What?" "Just come back, man," Kyle added, his voice shaky. Tommy trudged back to the campfire, annoyed. "What's your problem?" Mark looked confused too. "Yeah, what's going on?" Kyle and I started talking over each other, trying to explain what we'd seen. There was something huge back there. It was walking on 2 legs. It had to be 7 feet tall. It was covered in hair. Mark started laughing. "Yeah, right. You guys are just trying to scare us." "No, I swear to God," I said, my heart still pounding. "Kyle, you saw it too, right?" Kyle nodded frantically. It was right behind Tommy, like 20 yards back, walking upright. Tommy's face went pale, but then he looked back toward the house. "There's nothing there. You guys are making this up." "We're not," I insisted. "It crossed behind you and went into the woods on the other side." But Mark and Tommy wouldn't believe us. Mark kept saying we were trying to prank them, and Tommy eventually decided to head back to the house anyway. Though he ran the whole way this time, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. The 3 of us stayed by the fire, but everything felt different now. The woods seemed darker, the noises more threatening. Mark still thought we were making it up, but Kyle and I kept scanning the darkness with our flashlights, jumping at every sound. "What do you think it was?" Kyle whispered, when Mark went to take a leak behind a nearby tree. "I don't know," I said, "but it wasn't a person." "No way." Kyle nodded. "It looked like, Bigfoot or something." I'd had the same thought, but was afraid to say it out loud. It sounded ridiculous, but what else could explain what we'd seen? It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright for that long. It wasn't a person. No person is that big or moves that way. And the hair, that dark, shaggy hair covering its body. Mark came back and must have overheard us because he rolled his eyes. "Bigfoot? Seriously? You guys are such liars." But we knew what we'd seen. We stayed up most of the night, barely talking. Kyle and I took turns keeping watch while the other tried to sleep, though I don't think either of us actually got any rest. Every few minutes, one of us would shine the flashlight around the perimeter of our little camp, searching for any movement in the grass or trees. Mark eventually fell asleep, still convinced we were pulling his leg. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something heavy moving through the woods behind us. Not like a raccoon or possum, something big that made branches crack. I nudged Kyle awake, and we both sat frozen, listening. The sounds continued for maybe 5 minutes, circling around our camp, but staying just far enough away that we couldn't see anything when we pointed our flashlights toward the noise. "Should we wake Mark?" Kyle whispered. I shook my head. He won't believe us anyway. Eventually, the sounds faded. When the sky finally began to lighten around 5:30, I felt like I could breathe again. We packed up as soon as it was light enough to see, not even bothering with breakfast. Mark was confused by our rush, but went along with it. When we got back to the house, my mum could tell something was wrong. "You boys look exhausted. Didn't you sleep?" "We're fine," I said. I knew she wouldn't believe us either. After Kyle and Mark left, I went back to the spot where we'd seen the thing. The grass was still wet with dew, and I searched for footprints or any evidence of what we'd seen. All I found was some vague depressions in the grass. Not clear footprints, but areas where something heavy had stepped. They were spaced about 4 feet apart. For weeks afterward, Kyle and I would talk about it when no one else was around. We compared notes, making sure our memories matched. They always did. The height, the hair, the way it moved. We'd seen the same thing. My parents sold that property 3 years later, and I was honestly relieved. I never camped in that backfield again, though I'd still look out my bedroom window at night, scanning the tree line with a flashlight I kept by my bed. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I know what Kyle and I saw that night. A creature at least 6.5 feet tall, covered in dark hair, walking upright on 2 legs, with a strange bent-knee gait, and arms that hung too low and swung with each step. It moved through our property with a silent, efficient grace that still gives me chills when I think about it. The most terrifying part wasn't just seeing it, it was realizing it had been watching us. It knew exactly where we were. It was tracking behind Tommy as he walked alone in the dark. What would have happened if we hadn't spotted it with our flashlights? That's the question that still keeps me up sometimes. 26 years have passed, and I've never seen anything like it again. Kyle and I lost touch after high school, but I sometimes wonder if he still thinks about that night too. I know I do, especially when I'm camping and hear something heavy moving just beyond the firelight, just out of sight. Story 13. I've always been skeptical about all those Bigfoot stories. Always thought they were just tall tales people made up for attention, or because they mistook a bear for something else. That was until last summer, and I still get chills thinking about what happened that night on Lake Oki Chobee. It was late June of 2018, one of those sticky Florida evenings where the humidity makes your clothes cling to your skin. My cousin Marcus and I had been planning this night fishing trip for weeks. Both of us work construction, so we don't get many chances to just relax and do something we enjoy. Lake Oki Chobee has some great spots if you know where to go, and we'd been fishing there since we were kids. We launched my 14-foot John boat around 9 in the evening from the public ramp on the north shore. The lake was calm that night, barely a ripple on the surface, and there was a full moon so bright you could almost read by it. Perfect fishing conditions. We motored about 20 minutes to this little inlet I know, surrounded by sawgrass and these old cypress stumps that stick out of the water. It's secluded. No houses, no lights, no other boats, just the kind of spot where the big bass hide. I tied us off to one of the stumps, and we settled in for what should have been a peaceful night of fishing. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. We had our beers in the cooler, lines in the water, just shooting the shit like we always do. I'd caught 2 decent-sized bass, and Marcus was still waiting for his first bite. The frogs and crickets were making their usual racket, and occasionally we'd hear a splash from a jumping fish. It was exactly what we needed after a long week of work. Around 11:30, something changed. I remember checking my watch because I was thinking about moving to a different spot if the fish didn't start biting soon. That's when I first noticed how quiet it had gotten. The frogs and crickets that had been so loud earlier had completely stopped. It was that kind of silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. "You hear that?" Marcus asked me, his voice lower than normal. "I don't hear anything," I said. "That's the problem." We both felt it at the same time. That sensation of being watched. You know that feeling, right? When your instincts are screaming that something's not right, even though you can't put your finger on why. Then we heard it. A splash behind the boat. Not like a fish jumping, but something heavy hitting the water. I turned so fast I almost dropped my rod. Marcus was already pointing his flashlight toward the sound. All we could see were ripples spreading across the surface. "Probably just a gator," I said, trying to convince myself more than him. Marcus nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe it either. We've been around gators our whole lives. This didn't sound like a gator. We tried to get back to fishing, but the mood had changed. The silence was getting to us. I was straining to hear anything, frogs, crickets, even the wind, but there was nothing. A few minutes later there was another splash, this time from the shoreline about 30 yards away. It sounded like someone had thrown a rock into the water. Marcus swung his light toward the noise, and I swear I saw something duck down behind the bank. Just a dark shape moving quickly out of sight. "Did you see that?" Marcus whispered. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Something's over there." Before we could decide what to do, there was a third splash. Louder and much closer. A rock or something hit the water right beside our boat, splashing water all over our tackle boxes. This wasn't random. Whatever was out there was throwing things at us. "What the hell, man?" Marcus hissed. "Someone messing with us?" I was about to suggest we leave when we heard it. A deep, rumbling grunt from the water's edge. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I recognized either. It was somewhere in between, like someone trying to imitate a bear but not quite getting it right. Then came the sound of movement through the sawgrass and reeds, heavy steps pushing through the vegetation with purpose. Whatever it was big, really big. My hands were shaking as I picked up my heavy-duty maglite. Part of me didn't want to see what was making those sounds, but I had to know. I pointed the beam toward where the noise was coming from and swept it back and forth until the light caught something. I'll never forget what I saw. Standing half hidden behind a cypress stump at the edge of the reeds was something. At first my brain tried to make it into a man, some huge guy playing a prank, but no man looks like that. This thing was massive, way taller than any person I've ever seen. It was covered in what looked like black hair or fur, thick all over its body. Its chest and shoulders were incredibly wide and powerful looking, like a bodybuilder, but wider and more natural. Its arms hung down way lower than a normal person's would, almost to its knees. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. Even from that distance I could see it wasn't human. It had this flat, wide nose and a mouth that seemed to stretch too far across its face. And the eyes. Jesus, the eyes. They reflected back orange-red in my flashlight beam, like a cat's but bigger. And they were staring right at us, not blinking, not moving, just watching. For a few seconds, we all just froze. Me, Marcus, and this creature. Then it stepped forward out from behind the stump. And we could see all of it. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its legs were massive, each thigh probably as wide as my torso, and it stood completely upright like a man, but there was nothing manlike about its proportions. That's when it screamed. I don't know how else to describe it. It started as this high-pitched roar that made my ears hurt, then dropped into a deep growl that I could feel vibrating in my chest. It was so loud it echoed across the water. I've never heard anything like it before or since. The thing bent down. I thought it was charging us at first, but instead It picked something up from the ground. Before I could even react, it hurled whatever it was at our boat with incredible force. There was a loud thwack as it hit the side of the boat, and Marcus's fishing rod went flying overboard. "Go, go, go!" Marcus was screaming, and I snapped out of my frozen state. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. I threw it into reverse, nearly hitting a submerged stump as I backed away from the shore. The creature hadn't moved. It was just standing there, watching us leave, like it had accomplished what it wanted. As I turned the boat toward the open channel, I took one last look. It was still there, this massive dark silhouette against the reeds, eyes reflecting in my light. Then I hit the throttle and got us the hell out of there. We didn't speak much on the way back to the ramp. What was there to say? We both saw it, we both heard it. This wasn't a bear or a guy in a suit. No costume could move that naturally or throw with that kind of strength. When we got the boat back on the trailer, we found a dent in the fiberglass, where whatever it threw had hit us, about the size of a baseball, but deep enough that it had cracked the gel coat. Physical evidence that we hadn't imagined it. On the drive home, Marcus finally broke the silence. "That was a Sasquatch, wasn't it? A friggin' Bigfoot." I didn't answer right away. I'd spent my whole life thinking those stories were bullshit, but what else could it have been? "Yeah," I finally said, "I think it was. We've told a few close friends what happened, but most people just laugh it off or think we're exaggerating. I get it. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. I've done some research since then. Turns out there have been other sightings around Lake Oki Chobee over the years. People talk about a skunk ape in the Everglades, but I didn't smell anything that night. Just saw something that shouldn't exist, according to science. One thing I know for sure, I've never gone back to that fishing spot. I haven't been night fishing at all since then. Marcus says he still goes sometimes, but never alone, and never on that part of the lake. I keep asking myself why it threw rocks at us instead of just attacking. The best I can figure is that it was trying to scare us off, defending its territory, and it worked. Message received loud and clear. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that scream in my head, seeing those eyes reflecting in the darkness. I used to not believe in monsters. Now I know better. They're out there, hiding in the places we think we know, just waiting for us to stumble into their world. Story 14. I've been living with something terrifying for almost 12 years now. I've never really told the whole story, because honestly, who would believe me? But after what happened again last week, I need to get this off my chest. It all started back in the summer of 2011. We live in Oak Ridge County, in a rural area with about 5 acres of land. Our property backs up to hundreds of acres of dense forest. I've always loved the privacy, the quiet, and being surrounded by nature. At least I did, until that summer. My friend Taylor was going through a rough divorce and needed a place to stay. She's always been the outdoorsy type, and actually preferred to camp in our backyard, rather than use our spare bedroom. She set up a small tent at the edge of our property, maybe 50 yards from our back door, and she planned to stay for a few months while sorting out her living situation. About 3 weeks into her stay, Taylor started mentioning strange things happening at night. At first, it was just offhand comments about hearing something walking around her tent. I didn't think much of it. We get deer, raccoons, and other wildlife all the time, but then she got more specific, saying whatever was walking around her tent was way too heavy to be a deer, and it seemed to deliberately circle her tent. "Shannon, I'm telling you, this isn't normal wildlife," she told me one morning over coffee. "It walks on 2 legs. I can tell by the cadence of the footsteps." I laughed it off, but Taylor wasn't amused. "I grew up hunting with my dad. I know what deer sound like. I know what bears sound like. This is different." Then came that night in July. It was around 2 in the morning when my phone lit up with text messages from Taylor. I was annoyed at first. Who texts at 2 a.m.? But when I read them, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Shannon, are you awake? There's something outside my tent. It's breathing. I can hear it sniffing around the edges." It's huge. I'm scared to move. I texted back. Probably just a curious deer. No, this is not a deer. Please come out with a flashlight, please. I was irritated, but also concerned. Taylor isn't the type to panic easily. I grabbed my robe, slipped on my boots, and took a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. My husband, Mark, grunted something as I got out of bed, but he didn't wake up completely. When I stepped outside, the summer air was still warm, but I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. The night was eerily quiet. No insects, no distant owls, nothing. Just dead silence. I swept my flashlight across the yard toward Taylor's tent. Calling her name softly, she unzipped the tent flap and poked her head out, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "Did you see anything on your way out?" she whispered. "No, nothing," I replied, still keeping my voice low for some reason. "What happened?" "It was right here, Shannon, right outside my tent. I could hear it breathing. It was sniffing around like it was trying to figure out what was inside. The footsteps were heavy, like really heavy, and it smelled, I don't know how to describe it, musky, like wet dog, but worse. I didn't see anything unusual that night, but I helped Taylor move her tent closer to the house. She stayed another month before finding an apartment, and while she mentioned hearing the footsteps a few more times, nothing as intense as that night happened again. I had almost forgotten about the whole thing until the following summer. My daughters, Emma and Lily, were 16 and 17 at the time. One evening in August, they were hanging out in the backyard, sitting by our fire pit and just chatting. Suddenly, the back door slammed open, and they both ran in, breathless and wide-eyed with fear. "Mum!" exclamation mark, Emma gasped. "There's something in the woods." Lily was trembling. "We saw something huge standing at the tree line." I sighed, thinking they were being dramatic teenagers. "Probably just a deer or maybe a black bear," I said, trying to sound reassuring. Emma shook her head violently. "Mom, it was standing upright, on two legs. It was massive. Like 7 or 8 feet tall," Lily added. "And it had these really broad shoulders." I felt that same chill I'd experienced the summer before, but I still tried to rationalize it. Girls, black bears sometimes stand on their hind legs. "That's probably what you saw." They weren't convinced, and honestly, neither was I, but I wasn't ready to consider alternatives. About an hour later, the girls were in the kitchen getting snacks when Lily screamed. I rushed in to find them both pressed against the counter, staring out the window that overlooked our pool area. "It's there again," Emma whispered, pointing with a shaking finger. I looked out, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. "Where?" "By the pool shed. It was just standing there watching the house." We turned on all the exterior lights, and Mark went out with a flashlight and his shotgun to check. He didn't find anything, but the girls refused to go outside after dark for the rest of the summer. I still tried to dismiss it all as overactive imaginations or misidentified wildlife. But then came November 27th, 2012. The night I couldn't deny what was happening anymore. I had gotten a puppy, a German shepherd named Max, about 5 months earlier. That night, around midnight, I took him out for his last bathroom break before bed. It was chilly, so I wore my heavy coat and brought a headlamp, since the yard lights weren't reaching the area where Max liked to do his business. Max was sniffing around near the edge of the woods, and I was getting impatient, tired, and ready to go back inside. Then I heard it. Movement in the brush. Not just a little rustling, but the sound of something substantial moving through the underbrush. "Max, come," I called, suddenly alert. He didn't listen, instead moving closer to the woods, his ears perked forward. I directed my headlamp toward the sound, and that's when it happened. Someone, stood up from the underbrush at the edge of the woods. The beam from my headlamp didn't reach that far clearly, but I could see enough. It was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, with impossibly broad shoulders. The moonlight caught its chest, and I could see it was covered in dark fur or hair. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I felt its eyes on me. Then my brain finally caught up with what I was seeing, and I screamed. I screamed louder than I've ever screamed in my life. Max started barking frantically, and I grabbed his collar, turned, and ran for the house, not looking back once. I burst through the back door, slamming and locking it behind me. Mark came running downstairs, followed by our son Josh, who was 20 at the time. "What the hell is going on?" Mark demanded, seeing my state. I was hyperventilating, barely able to speak. "Outside, there's something huge by the woods." Mark looked at me like I was crazy, but Josh grabbed a flashlight and his hunting rifle and headed for the door. "Josh, no!" I grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there." "Mom, it's okay," he said calmly. "Dad and I will check it out." Despite my protests, they went outside. I stood at the window, watching their flashlight beams sweep across the yard toward the woods. They were out there for maybe 15 minutes before coming back in. "Did you see it?" I asked the moment they came through the door. Mark shook his head, but Josh had a strange look on his face. "I saw something moving up the hillside, through those old tires and brush, heading toward the spring," Josh said quietly. "It was big, Mom, really big, and it was moving fast for its size, but not like a bear, more upright." "What did it look like?" I pressed. Josh hesitated. "It was dark, but it looked like a massive, fur-covered figure, walking on two legs." Mark tried to dismiss it, saying Josh probably saw a bear, but Josh was adamant. "Dad, I've been hunting since I was 12. I know what a bear looks like, even at night. This wasn't a bear." After that night, we couldn't deny it anymore. 3 separate sightings by different family members, Taylor, the girls, and then me and Josh. We were dealing with something unexplainable, something that most people would laugh off as imagination or hoax. But we knew what we saw. We started researching, and everything pointed to one conclusion, as ridiculous as it sounds. Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. Over the years, we've had more incidents. Footprints in the mud by the spring that are 16 inches long. Strange vocalizations at night that sound almost like whoop howls. Wood knocks that seem to respond when we make similar sounds. And occasionally, that same musky, wild smell that Taylor described. We've learned to coexist with whatever it is. We don't go out at night alone anymore. We keep the exterior lights on. We don't leave food outside, and strangely, I don't feel threatened by it. Terrified, yes, but not in danger. It seems more curious than aggressive. Last week, I was sitting on our back deck around dusk, just enjoying the evening air. Max, now an old dog, was lying at my feet. Suddenly, he lifted his head and stared intently at the tree line. I followed his gaze and saw it, that same massive silhouette, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, watching the house. My heart raced, but I didn't run this time. I just sat there, and it stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Then it simply turned and melted back into the forest. I've accepted that this is part of our lives now. Something incredible and terrifying shares our land. No one believes us when we hint at what we've experienced, so we've stopped trying to convince people. But I know what I saw. My family knows what they saw. Whatever it is, it's still out there. And sometimes, when I look out at the trees at dusk, I can feel it watching me too. Afiki. Story 15. I've debated posting this for years. What happened to me in 2001 still keeps me up some nights, and I've never really found a good explanation. I worked as a tour guide at Lake Shasta Caverns in Northern California for about 3 years. It was a pretty sweet gig most of the time. I got to show people through these amazing limestone caves, tell them about the formations, that kind of thing. The caverns are on this mountain peninsula that juts into the lake, and you can only access them by taking a boat across and then a bus up the mountain. It's really isolated. I'd been working there since '98, and nothing weird ever happened until March of 2001. It started with small things. About a week before the main incident, I began hearing rocks hitting the side of the entrance building where I was stationed. At first, I didn't think much of it, maybe just some debris falling from the hill above, but then it kept happening, and the frequency increased. It wasn't like constant rockfall either. There would be one rock, then 5 minutes later, another one, almost like someone was throwing them. What made it weirder was that the terrain above the entrance building isn't the type where you'd expect random rockfalls. It's heavily wooded with thick brush and tall trees. Rocks don't just tumble down through all that. After a few days of this, I mentioned it to my manager, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just animals or maybe kids messing around. By March 3rd or 4th, honestly, the days kind of blur together now, I was getting seriously unnerved. I was working alone that day. We were in our slow season, so we'd scaled back to just one guide for the last tours. It was a cloudy, gloomy afternoon, and I was getting ready for the final tour at 4:30. The weather had kept most visitors away, and when the bus arrived from the dock, there were only 2 tourists, a couple in their early 30s, I'd guess. The woman had this bright red rain jacket on, and the guy was carrying an expensive-looking camera with a huge zoom lens. After the bus driver dropped us off at the mountaintop overlook, he always went back down to wait by the bus, I started my usual spiel about the caverns and their history. That's when we first heard it, this rustling sound coming from the trees across the ravine. Not just leaves blowing in the wind, but heavy movement, followed by these deep, thumping sounds, like something big was walking. The guy with the camera immediately turned toward the noise and started scanning the area through his lens. Then he said, "Hey, what's that path over there?" He pointed to this weird, trench-like depression cutting down the hillside opposite us, heading straight toward the lake. I'll never forget the chill I felt when I looked where he was pointing. I'd worked there for 3 years and had never noticed that path before. It looked almost like something had repeatedly dragged itself down the same route, wearing away the vegetation. As we stood there watching, we could see large trees swaying, not just branches moving in the wind, but entire trees like something was pushing past them. Whatever it was, moved rapidly through the forest, and I remember thinking it had to be really strong to make trees that size move. What happened next still makes my heart race when I think about it. This figure burst out from the overgrowth. It was running upright on 2 legs, with these massive arms swinging in these wide arcs. The whole sighting probably lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds before it disappeared back into the underbrush. But those seconds are burned into my memory. It was tall, way taller than any human I've ever seen, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and broad, not fat, but just massive across the shoulders and chest. The color was uniformly dark, either deep brown or black, but I couldn't make out any facial features from that distance. The way it moved was what really got to me. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you might expect from something that big. It was fast and seemed to know exactly where it was going. After it disappeared, we could still hear this rhythmic pounding as it ran downhill toward the lake. Then everything went quiet. Too quiet. All the birds had stopped chirping, and even the wind seemed to die down. The woman grabbed her husband's arm so hard, I could see her knuckles turn white. "What the fuck was that?" she kept saying, over and over. The guy was frantically scrolling through his camera, trying to see if he'd captured anything. I asked him if he got a picture, and he just shook his head, looking pale. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely operate my radio. I called down to the bus crew at the bottom of the mountain. "Hey, be careful down there. We just saw something unusual up here." The response I got was just static at first. Then the bus driver came on, asking for clarification. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound crazy, so I just told him to keep an eye out and that we were coming down early. I apologized to the couple and told them we'd have to skip the cave tour today due to safety concerns. They didn't argue. Nobody said much as we waited for the bus to come back up. The woman kept scanning the tree line, and the guy just stared at his camera with this look of disappointment. I think he was kicking himself for not getting a photo. When we got back to the main facility, the couple and I exchanged contact information. They promised to reach out if they remembered anything else or if the guy found any usable images on his camera. But I never heard from them again, which still bothers me. I've often wondered if they just wanted to forget the whole thing, or if something prevented them from contacting me. I quit my job 2 weeks later. I just couldn't feel comfortable being alone on that mountain anymore. My manager tried to convince me to stay, saying I was one of their best guides, but I made up some excuse about moving away for family reasons. The thing is, the more I thought about it afterwards, the more it made sense that something could live out there undiscovered. That area is basically a peninsula surrounded by water on 3 sides, accessible only by boat, with dense wilderness stretching for miles. It's the perfect habitat for something that doesn't want to be found. I've gone back and forth about what we actually saw that day. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear, but bears don't run upright like that. And it definitely wasn't a person in a suit. No human could move with that kind of power or speed. The trees this thing was pushing through weren't saplings, they were mature trees. What really gets me is the rock throwing from the days before. It's like whatever this thing was, it had been watching me, maybe trying to get my attention or scare me off. And that path down the hillside, how had I never noticed it before? How long had it been there? I've read up on Bigfoot encounters since then, and a lot of the details match what other people have reported. The rock throwing, the speed and strength, the way it disappeared so quickly. The area around Shasta has had sightings going back decades, though most people don't talk about them openly for fear of ridicule. I tried reporting what happened to a forest ranger about a month later, but I could tell from his face that he thought I was either crazy or pulling his leg. He took my statement, but I doubt anything came of it. The couple never went public with their experience either, as far as I know. Sometimes I drive past Lake Shasta and look across the water toward the caverns, wondering if it's still out there. I've never gone back on the tour, though. Part of me wants to, just to see if that path is still visible on the hillside, but a bigger part of me is afraid of what I might find. I'm still not sure what we saw that day. All I know is that it was real, it was massive, and it moved like nothing I've ever seen before or since. Whatever lives in those woods around Lake Shasta, it's not something that shows up in biology textbooks, and it's made me realize how much we still don't know about the wilderness areas right in our own backyard. Since then, I've moved to a more populated area and taken a job that keeps me away from isolated places. Call it paranoia if you want. But something changes in you when you realize you're not at the top of the food chain. I still love nature and the outdoors, but these days I stick to well-traveled trails and I never go hiking alone. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I try not to believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and those moments on that cloudy March afternoon will stay with me forever. Story 16. I ain't written this down before. Not once in all these years, but I'm an old man now, and some things need telling before they're gone for good. It was the fall of 1963, November, I think, cold enough that your breath came out in clouds, but not so cold that hunting was miserable. I was 16 then, still had my whole life ahead of me, though I didn't know what to do with it. My daddy wanted me working at the paper mill after graduation, but I wasn't so sure. Me and 4 of my buddies, Dale, Tommy, Jackson and Mike, we all loved coon hunting. Nothing better than letting the dogs run while we followed along with our lanterns and flashlights. We'd bring back a few raccoons, sell the pelts for pocket money. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about being out there, feeling like men. That night we piled into Tommy's old pickup. His daddy had finally let him drive it on his own, and we felt like kings cruising down those country roads. We headed out to Marlow Bottom, south of Tyler. It was good hunting ground, lots of woods, not too many houses, and the locals didn't mind us being there. We'd been there plenty of times before. We had 3 dogs with us, Blue, who was mine, plus Tommy's two, Rusty and Scout, good hunting dogs, trained by their daddies before them. They knew how to tree a coon and wait for us. Never failed us before. We parked the truck near the edge of the woods, grabbed our gear and headed out. Each of us had a .22 rifle, except for Jackson, who carried his daddy's old 12-gauge. We all had flashlights, and Tommy and I carried kerosene lanterns too. It was about 8 o'clock when we let the dogs off their leads. They took off like they always did, noses to the ground, tails wagging. For about an hour, everything was normal. We followed the sound of the dogs, smoking cigarettes and talking about girls at school, baseball, and whatever else teenage boys talked about back then. The moon was nearly full, so we could see pretty good even without our lights. The dogs would bark now and then, following scents, but nothing serious yet. Then around 9:30 we heard it, that baying that tells you they've treed something. All 3 dogs, going crazy. "They got one!" Dale yelled, and we all started running toward the sound. We were maybe a quarter mile in, not too deep, but far enough that the truck was out of sight. I remember the excitement, the way we ran through those woods, jumping over logs, ducking under branches. We'd done this dozens of times before. We knew exactly what we'd find, a raccoon up in a tree, the dog circling below, waiting for us to come shoot it down. But something felt off as we got closer. The dog's barking changed. It wasn't that excited. We got one bark anymore. It was different, higher pitched, frightened almost, and then all of a sudden they went quiet, dead quiet. That ain't normal. Dogs don't just stop barking when they've treed something. "What the hell?" Tommy said, slowing down. We all did. "Blue?" I called out. Blue exclamation mark, nothing. No barks, no howls, no rustling, just silence. We moved slower now, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The lanterns swung at our sides, throwing weird shadows against the trees. We were maybe 50 yards from where we'd last heard the dogs. "You think a bear got 'em?" Mike whispered. Bears weren't common, but they weren't unheard of either. "Nah," Jackson said, but he pumped his shotgun anyway. Then we saw them. All 3 dogs, huddled together at the base of a big pine tree. They weren't barking. They weren't moving. They were just sitting there, trembling. I'd never seen Blue scared of anything before, not ever. We stopped about 20 feet away. Our lights played across the scene, the dogs, the tree, and then, God help me, I still see it when I close my eyes some nights. It wasn't up in the tree like a coon would be. It was standing beside it, a massive shape, covered in thick reddish-brown fur. At first I thought it was a bear, standing on its hind legs. But bears don't stand 7 or 8 feet tall. And bears don't have those long arms, and bears don't... It turned toward us, and our lights caught its face. Not a bear, not an animal I'd ever seen before. The face was, I don't know how to describe it, almost human, but not. Flat nose, deep-set eyes that reflected our lights like a deer's, but bigger. So much bigger. For a second, probably only a second, but it felt like forever. Nobody moved. Not us. Not the dogs. Not it. Then it started moving its arms. Not like it was threatening us, more like it was confused, agitated, its arms just flailing around, back and forth, up and down, like it didn't know what to do with them, and then it started making noise. I've heard a lot of animals in my time. Coyotes howling, bobcats screaming, even a cougar once, down near the river. Nothing, and I mean nothing, sounded like what came out of that thing's mouth. It was a howl, but not like a wolf. It was deeper, louder, but also higher at the same time, if that makes any sense. Like it started in its chest and then just kept going up and up until it hurt your ears. I couldn't move. None of us could. It was like my feet were nailed to the ground. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my flashlight. The beam pointed at the ground, but I could still see the thing in Tommy's light. I don't know how long we stood there. 10 seconds? 30? It felt like hours. Then Jackson raised his shotgun. I remember wanting to tell him to stop, but no words would come out. He fired a shot, not directly at the thing. I think he was too scared to aim properly, but close enough. The blast echoed through the woods. For a split second, everything was still again. Then the creature let out another sound, not a howl this time, a growl, a deep, rumbling growl that I swear to God I could feel in my chest, like standing next to a train when it goes by. It was so powerful, so angry, and that broke the spell. Blue was the first to run, tearing past me with his tail between his legs. The other dogs followed, and then we were all running. I dropped my lantern. I heard it smash behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran. We all did. I don't remember much about that run back to the truck. Just branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me, and the sound of my friends crashing through the underbrush nearby. I know I fell at least once, tore my jeans open at the knee, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was getting away. I don't know if it followed us. I never looked back. Not once. We all reached the truck within seconds of each other. The dogs were already there, circling and whining. Tommy fumbled with his keys, cursing and praying all at once. The engine caught on the third try, and we piled in, all 5 of us in the cab, the dogs in the back. Tommy hit the gas so hard we fishtailed on the dirt road. Nobody spoke for the first few miles, just heavy breathing and the occasional Jesus Christ, or what the hell was that? The dogs were still whining in the truck bed. Finally, Dale broke the real silence. What did we just see? Nobody answered right away. What could we say? Bear, Mike said finally. Had to be a bear, but we all knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that. Bears don't have faces like that. Bears don't make sounds like that. We can't tell nobody, Jackson said suddenly. They'll think we're crazy. He was right. Who would believe us? This was 1963 in East Texas. People didn't talk about monsters in the woods. There was no such thing as Bigfoot back then. Not to us, anyway. We'd never heard of such a thing. This was before all those films and TV shows, before people started looking for these creatures. Agreed, Tommy said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We don't tell nobody, not our parents, not our friends. Nobody. We all nodded. A pact was made. Tommy dropped us each off at our homes. I remember my mama asking why I was back so early, why my jeans were torn, where my rifle was. I'd left it in the woods, along with my lantern and flashlight. I told her I'd fallen in the dark, gotten spooked, and the others had wanted to come home, a partial truth. She looked suspicious, but didn't press it. I didn't sleep that night, or much for the next week. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing, heard that howl, felt that growl in my chest. We kept our pact. We never talked about it, not even among ourselves. The next day at school, we acted like nothing had happened. When we passed each other in the halls, we'd just nod. That was it. After a few weeks, we stopped hunting together, drifted apart. It was too much of a reminder. I never went back to Marlow Bottom, never went coon hunting again either. Told everyone I'd lost interest, but the truth was, I couldn't bring myself to go into the woods at night anymore. I still can't all these years later. I didn't think much about what to call the thing we saw. Not for a long time. Then in the 70s, all these stories started coming out. People talking about Bigfoot and Sasquatch. I saw a picture in a magazine once, some blurry thing from California, and my blood ran cold. It looked like what we'd seen. Not exactly, but close enough. Over the years, I've read accounts from other people, hunters, hikers, campers. Their descriptions match what we saw that night. That same reddish-brown fur, that same impossible height, those same unnaturally long arms, and some of them mention the sounds, those terrible, otherworldly sounds. Of the 5 of us who were there that night, I only know what happened to 3. Tommy died in Vietnam in '68. Dale became a preacher over in Houston, never mentioned that night to me again. Jackson moved away after high school. Lost track of him. I ran into Mike at a gas station about 15 years ago. We just nodded at each other. Some things you don't need to talk about to remember. Blue lived to be 14, but he was never the same after that night. Always nervous, especially after dark. He'd whine whenever I'd go near the edge of the woods behind our house. Like he was warning me, I'm an old man now. Most folks who knew me back then are gone. I've never told this story to anyone. Not my wife, not my kids, not my grandkids. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. And every time I hear about a new sighting, I think back to that night in Marlow Bottom, to that thing by the tree, to that sound that seemed to come from another world. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. But it was real. God help me. It was real. Story 17. I've never fully told this story outside our group. Not the whole thing anyway. It's been over 60 years now. But I remember that spring day in 1962 like it was yesterday. Some memories just burn themselves into your mind, especially when you're young and see something that changes how you understand the world. I was 15 then, living in Schoolcraft County, Michigan. We were just kids, really. Me, Bobby, David, Sarah, Mike, and Julie. I was sort of the unofficial leader of our little gang. We'd been friends since elementary school, and we did everything together back then. It was mid-April, warm enough that we didn't need heavy jackets anymore. The snow had finally melted, and the world had that fresh spring smell. You know, when everything's coming back to life after a long winter. We were bored that Saturday, so we decided to walk the railroad tracks near Marblehead Creek. It was something we did pretty often when the weather was nice, just walking the tracks, talking about school, movies, whatever kids talked about back then. We'd been walking for maybe an hour. The tracks cut through some pretty dense forest in that area, with swampy patches on either side. It was around 4 in the afternoon. I remember checking my watch not long before it happened. The sun was still up, but starting to get that golden late afternoon quality to it. We were laughing about something stupid. I think Mike had told some dumb joke about our math teacher when this sound cut through everything. I've spent decades trying to describe that sound accurately. It wasn't exactly a growl, not really a roar either. It was this deep, guttural noise that seemed to come from something with lungs twice the size of a human's. It was loud enough that we all froze instantly, and it came from behind us. I remember turning around slowly, like my body knew before my brain did that I shouldn't make any sudden movements. What I saw coming up the hill toward the railroad tracks, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. At first, my brain tried to make it into something familiar, a bear maybe, or some guy in dark clothes. But no bear walks on 2 legs like that, and no human is built that way. This thing was massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was walking with its head kind of bent down and turned sideways, like it was looking at us, but trying to be, I don't know, cautious maybe. It was about 110 feet away, but even at that distance, you could tell this wasn't anything normal. It was covered in this long, dark brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like hair, but all over its body except its face and hands. The hair on its legs and arms had mud matted in it, like it had been wading through the swamp. Its face looked darker than the rest of it, almost dirty, and the hair on its chest was shorter than on its back and head. The arms, God, the arms were the worst part. They hung down way too far, almost to its knees, and it swung them as it walked with its hands open. There was something so deliberate about the way it moved. Not clumsy or animal-like, purposeful. None of us screamed. That's the weird part I still think about. 6 teenagers see something impossible, and none of us made a sound. We just stood there, frozen, watching this thing cross the tracks about 100 feet in front of us. Then it started going down the other side, into this swampy area with thick brush and small trees. I don't know what came over me, but once it disappeared from view, I snapped out of it and whispered, "Come on!" The others looked at me like I was insane, but I started running toward where we'd seen it cross. I was terrified, but also intensely curious. I had to know what we'd just seen. After hesitating for a second, they followed me. We ran to the spot where it had crossed the tracks and looked down into the swamp. There was nothing there, no movement, no breaking branches, just stillness. But the smell, I'll never forget that smell. It was like a mix of decomposing animal and rotten fish, but with something else I couldn't identify. It made my eyes water. We spent maybe 20 minutes searching the area. The ground around the tracks was too hard packed to show footprints, and the swampy area was too wet and muddy to hold clear tracks. It was like the thing had vanished into thin air, leaving only that horrible smell behind. When we finally gave up searching, we huddled together on the tracks, all of us talking at once. "What the hell was that?" David kept saying. Sarah was shaking. Bobby, who was usually the most level-headed of us, suggested it might have been a bear, but even he didn't sound convinced. "That was no bear," Julie said. "Bears don't walk on two legs like that, not for that long. And they don't have faces like that," Mike added. "Or arms. Did you see those arms?" I remember nodding, still trying to process what I'd seen. "It was watching us," I said. It knew we were here. We decided to call it the Marblehead monster right then and there. It sounds silly now, but giving it a name somehow made it less terrifying. We made a pact not to tell anyone about what we'd seen. This was years before Bigfoot was a household name, before the Patterson-Gimlin film made Bigfoot famous. Back then, if you told adults you saw a giant hairy man creature in the woods, they'd think you were either lying or crazy. The walk back to town was tense. We stayed close together, constantly looking over our shoulders. Every crack of a branch made us jump. I kept thinking about those long arms, the way it moved, the intelligence in its posture. It wasn't just some animal. There was something almost human about it, but not quite. We made it back to town just as the sun was setting. Standing at the corner where we usually split up to go to our different homes, none of us wanted to be the first to leave the group. Finally, Mike said what we were all thinking. What if it followed us? "It didn't follow us," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It went the other way." "But what if there are more of them?" Sarah asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for that. None of us did. We eventually went our separate ways, but I barely slept that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, analyzing every detail, the way it moved, the proportions of its body, that smell. I convinced myself that in the light of day, I'd realize it was just a bear or some other explanation. But morning came, and I was more certain than ever that we'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. The next day, Sunday, we all met up at our usual spot by the convenience store. Nobody had told their parents. We reaffirmed our pact of secrecy, but Mike suggested we go back to the spot with his dad's camera. "If we get a picture, people will have to believe us," he argued, but something held us back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something deeper, some instinctive understanding that this thing existed in a world separate from ours, and bringing proof back would somehow cross a line that shouldn't be crossed. We never did go back as a group. Bobby moved away that summer. Julie and Sarah gradually stopped hanging out with us boys. Life went on, as it always does. But every now and then over the years, one of us would call the others and just say, "Remember?" And we'd know exactly what they meant. As the years passed and Bigfoot became part of popular culture, I started reading everything I could find about similar encounters. Some details matched what we saw, the height, the hair, the long arms, but nothing quite captured the presence of the thing we saw that day. The intelligence in its movement, the deliberate way it observed us. I'm an old man now, and most of my friends from that day are gone. Mike passed last year, David in the 90s. I lost touch with Sarah and Julie decades ago, and sometimes I wonder if my memory has played tricks on me over the years, embellishing details, making the creature larger, more menacing. But then I'll be out hiking. Yes, even at my age, I still love the woods. And I'll catch a whiff of something that reminds me of that smell. Or I'll hear a branch break in a particular way, and I'm instantly 15 again. standing frozen on those railroad tracks, watching something impossible emerge from the tree line. I've never gone back to that specific spot. Part of me wants to see if there's any trace of the creature we called the Marblehead monster, but a bigger part of me is afraid. Not that I won't find anything, but that I will. Whatever we saw that April day in 1962, it changed me. It opened my mind to the possibility that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we can imagine. That just beyond the edges of our everyday existence, Marblehead monster was a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, some undiscovered species, or something else entirely. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. And sometimes, in my dreams, I still see those long arms swinging that sideways glance. And I wake up wondering if somewhere in the forests of Michigan, it's still out there, watching and waiting. Story 18. I've been sitting on this experience for decades now, debating whether to share it. I'm not one for tall tales or seeking attention. Anyone who knows me will tell you I'm about as straightforward as they come. What happened that day in 1969 changed how I look at the world, and I'm finally ready to talk about it. It was July 12th, 1969. I remember the date clearly because we were discussing the upcoming moon landing while working in the backyard. My son Kevin was 13 at the time, and he was helping me rebuild the old fence on our property on Cherokee Road in Oroville. It was hot as blazes that day, must have been in the 90s, and we were both sweating through our shirts by mid-morning. Our property backed up to a dense patch of woods, beautiful country, but wild. That's why we moved there in the first place. I wanted Kevin to grow up understanding nature, learning to hunt and fish like I did as a boy. The woods gave us privacy, but sometimes I felt like something was watching us from those trees. I'd shrug it off, thinking it was probably just deer, or maybe a black bear passing through. That morning started like any other. We had a simple breakfast, eggs and toast, and then headed out back to work on the fence. I was showing Kevin how to set the posts properly so they wouldn't lean after the first winter. Basic father-son stuff, you know? He was at that age where he was starting to take an interest in building things, and I was proud to teach him. We were about 2 hours into our work when I felt it. That sensation of being watched returned, stronger than ever before. The hair on my arm stood up despite the heat. I glanced toward the tree line, but didn't see anything unusual, so I returned to hammering a nail into the fence post. Kevin was the first to notice. He stopped mid-sentence while handing me another nail and froze completely. His face went pale, and his eyes widened like I'd never seen before. "Dad," he whispered, barely audible. "Look." I turned slowly, following his gaze toward our old outhouse that sat about 30 feet from the edge of the woods. What I saw there makes my heart race even now as I type this. Standing there, partially emerged from the tree line, was something I still can't fully explain. It was enormous, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair, grayish in color and about 3 inches long. It stood upright on 2 legs, unmistakably bipedal, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its face and hands were the only parts not covered in that gray hair. The face was... God, it's hard to describe even now. Flat and wide, with a pronounced brow ridge and a nose that was almost human but flattened. Its eyes were dark and deeply set, and I swear they held intelligence in them. The creature was female. That much was obvious from its large, pendulous breasts that hung against its torso. I know that sounds crude, but it's an important detail because it made the whole thing more shocking. This wasn't just some animal. It had distinct sexual characteristics like a human woman, but it was clearly not human. Kevin and I both stood completely still. I had instinctively put my arm out in front of my son, as if my skinny arm could protect him from something that massive. The creature didn't seem aggressive, more curious than anything. It was looking around our yard, specifically at the outhouse, tilting its head slightly like it was trying to understand what it was seeing. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, none of us moved. We were maybe 15 feet away from this thing, close enough that I could see its chest moving as it breathed, close enough to smell it, a strong, musky odor that wasn't entirely unpleasant, but was definitely wild. Then our old hound dog Rusty, who had been sleeping under the porch, finally caught wind of the visitor. He came tearing around the corner of the house, barking his head off like he'd caught the devil himself in our yard. The creature's reaction was immediate. It turned with surprising agility for something so large and bolted back into the woods. I've never seen anything that big move so fast. It covered ground in huge strides, crashing through the underbrush. The trees shook as it passed, and then it was gone, leaving nothing but swaying branches and disturbed leaves in its wake. Rusty stopped at the edge of the woods, barking frantically but not daring to follow. Smart dog. Kevin and I stood there in shock. My hammer had fallen to the ground, and Kevin was shaking visibly. I put my arm around his shoulders and felt him trembling. "Dad," he finally said, his voice cracking. What was that? I didn't have an answer then, and I'm not sure I have one now. "I don't know, son," was all I could manage. We abandoned our fence project for the day. I couldn't concentrate, and Kevin was too shaken up. We went inside, and I poured myself a stiff drink. I don't typically drink during the day, but this wasn't a typical day. Kevin kept looking out the windows toward the woods, like he expected the creature to return. That evening, I walked over to my neighbor Homer Stickley's place. Homer lived about a quarter-mile down the road, and his property extended deeper into the woods than ours. He was an old-timer, lived in Oroville all his life, and knew the area better than anyone. I wasn't sure how to bring up what we'd seen, afraid he'd think I was crazy or drunk. But before I could figure out how to start the conversation, Homer started talking about something strange happening on his property. "Charles," he said as we sat on his porch, "something's been stealing apples from my tree, and not like raccoons or bears. All the apples above 6 feet are gone, and the branches are broken clean, not clawed or chewed." I felt a chill despite the warm evening. "When did you notice this?" I asked. "Been happening for about a week now," he replied, sipping his coffee. "But that ain't all. There's been screaming in the woods at night, not like a mountain lion or coyote. Different, deeper, almost sounds like a woman in pain, but too loud, too powerful to be human." I took a deep breath and told him what Kevin and I had seen that morning. I expected skepticism, maybe even mockery, but Homer just nodded slowly, his weathered face serious. "Saw something myself 3 nights ago," he admitted. Moon was bright. I was up late reading, and I looked out my bedroom window that faces the meadow. There it was, walking across the open space, tall, hairy, walking on 2 legs. Thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but after what you're telling me. We talked for hours that night. Homer told me he'd heard stories from the old-timers, stories about wild people in the mountains, but he'd always dismissed them as tall tales, meant to scare children away from wandering too far into the woods. When I got home, Kevin was still awake, waiting for me. I told him about my conversation with Homer, figuring he deserved to know the truth. He'd seen it with his own eyes, after all. "Do you think it's dangerous, Dad?" he asked. And I could see he was still frightened. "It had a chance to hurt us today and didn't," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. It seemed more curious than anything. "But let's be careful for a while. No going into the woods alone, all right?" He nodded solemnly, and I realized my son had grown up a little that day, faced with something that challenged his understanding of the world. The next few weeks were tense. We finished the fence, but I made sure we worked only when the sun was high, and I kept my rifle propped against the nearest tree. We didn't see the creature again, but sometimes at night, we'd hear strange vocalizations from the woods, not quite human, not quite animal. Kevin took to sleeping in my room, on a mattress on the floor. I didn't mind. Truth be told, I felt better having him close. Word spread through Oroville. These weren't the days of internet and cell phones, but news traveled fast in a small community. By September, at least a dozen people had reported seeing similar creatures in the area. A woman who lived near Feather River swore she saw one drinking at the water's edge early one morning. A group of teenagers claimed they were chased by something massive and hairy while camping up near Bold Rock. Some folks started calling it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, names I'd heard before, but never took seriously. Others dismissed the whole thing as mass hysteria or a clever hoax. The local paper ran a small story, but without photographs or definitive evidence, interest eventually waned. But those of us who had seen it knew. We formed an unofficial group, meeting occasionally at Homer's place to share experiences and keep each other updated on new sightings. For at least 6 years after our initial encounter, reports continued to come in sporadically from around the Oroville area. Kevin had the hardest time with it all. He developed a fear of the dark that persisted well into his teens. He'd wake up screaming from nightmares about being chased through the woods. I sometimes wonder if I should have moved us away from Cherokee Road, given him a fresh start somewhere else. But this was our home, and running away didn't seem like the right lesson to teach my son. As for me, I became obsessed with finding an explanation. I read every book I could find on North American wildlife, native legends, and unexplained phenomena. I interviewed local Native American elders who shared stories passed down through generations about hairy men of the forest who should be respected and left alone. The most compelling theory I encountered came from an anthropology professor at Chico State who suggested we might be dealing with a small, isolated population of unknown primates, perhaps related to the extinct Gigantopithecus that once roamed Asia. He was careful not to endorse the idea publicly, academic reputation and all that, but in private conversations, he admitted the consistency of descriptions across different cultures and time periods was difficult to dismiss entirely. Looking back now, more than 50 years later, I still don't have definitive answers. Kevin's grown now with children and grandchildren of his own. He rarely talks about what we saw that day, though I know he hasn't forgotten. How could he? As for me, I still live in the same house on Cherokee Road. The woods don't frighten me anymore. Sometimes in the evening I sit on my back porch and look out at the tree line, wondering if she's still out there. That strange, hairy, woman-like creature that changed my understanding of the world in the summer of '69. I don't expect people to believe my story. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw, and nothing, no scientific explanation, no skeptic's dismissal, can take that experience away from me. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy our neat categorizations, things that remind us how little we truly understand about the wilderness that surrounds us. And sometimes, those things come right up to your backyard fence to take a curious look at your outhouse before disappearing back into the mystery of the forest.